Let me just explain how this works. So, folks, if you're new here or joining us for the first time, this is the weekly Apologetics Academy that we run every Saturday at 8 p.m. UK time, which is 3 p.m. Eastern, or 2 p.m. Central, or 12 noon Pacific. And the idea is we bring in different scholars and experts, apologists, on representing a range of viewpoints across the theological and philosophical spectrum. We have them present to us about their ideas, and then we have a session, an interactive session where people are welcome to ask questions and make comments and express disagreements, etc. And so if you're joining us as a viewer today, you are welcome to participate in a number of different ways. You can participate in the chat window, which you probably already found, and make sure that if you're participating in the chat that you direct your general chat to everyone rather than just panelists. Otherwise, hardly anyone can see you. You can also submit questions anonymously by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also click the raise hand button, and if you raise your hand, then I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our speaker this evening, and you'll have an opportunity to go back and forth and interact and dialogue, and ask questions, ask for clarification, express disagreement, make contributions, etc. Please try to keep the questions on topic. If you stray too far from the topic, I'll have to close it down because we want to try and have a focused discussion in our session. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Justin Bass from Dallas Theological Seminary. He is debated Bart Ehrman, a textual critic, who's written a number of books against Christianity, including misquoting Jesus most famously, and also how Jesus became God, which is of course relevant to what we're going to be discussing this evening. If you're around next week, we're going to be having on with us Dr. Günter Betschley, who's going to be talking to us about paleontological evidence bearing on the intelligent design debate. Dr. Günter Betschley is a German paleontologist who is a renowned expert on dragonfly paleontology in particular, but he's going to be talking to us about the fossil record as evidence for common descent and against neo-Darwinian evolution. So that's what's happening next week. So Justin, do you want to maybe just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are, and then you can maybe kick into your presentation? That would be amazing. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jonathan. My name's Justin Bass. I do teach part-time at Dallas Theological Seminary. In fact, we're going through Greek 101 and 102 right now, right in the midway of that semester. And I teach at a Bible college as well in the semesters called Dallas Christian College. And I'm also the pastor of a small church here in Frisco, which is a suburb of Dallas. And been doing that a little over 5 years now. And of course, I also love apologetics ever since I came to Christ in college, learning the evidences of the faith and who Jesus is and his claims and his death and his resurrection and everything about that has been my passion now for about, let's say, 15 years, I guess. I was 20 when I came to Christ. So this is definitely right up my alley. I love talking about anything that has to do with the historical Jesus, who I believe is the Lord of the world. So I guess I'll get going. I did want to say this is unique for me. This is the first time I've done a talk, a lecture online. This is really neat. I've never done a lecture where I didn't have to wear pants, but I assure you I am wearing pants. I just want to make sure everybody knows that. But thanks again, Jonathan, for doing this and having this great ministry. And I look forward to being a part of others and also attending some of these next ones that you had told us about, some great speakers you got coming from the believer and unbeliever side. Let me share my screen, make sure I have everything working here.
Let me just say also that there was a handout. I forgot to mention there's a handout associated with this session. So if anyone wants a copy, then just email me at jmclatchy@apologetics-academy.org, which I also put into the chat window just so people know if they want the handout. Thank you.
And that handout is free. No extra charge. No extra charge for that. Everybody, is this visible to everyone, Jonathan? Is this good?
Yep, that is good.
All right, and so one thing I like to start doing anytime I give a talk like this, I like to share just some of the books that I've really benefited from whatever topic I happen to be talking about. And so I thought I'd share a few of those books that y'all can get into. I'm sure most on here would love to trace down this topic more and study it more. And so I'm going to start with kind of the more lay level books to the more scholar level, because I know people viewing this online and also probably here, there's a whole spectrum. So starting with a very simple place to begin would be Who is Jesus by Dr. Bach. Daryl Bach, my professor at DTS. This is an excellent book, just talking about a lot of the packaging for a lay audience, just a lot of the key issues concerning the historical Jesus and the scholarly research, the historical Jesus versus the Christ of faith issues. But he has a lot of discussion on the Son of Man in here. Also, Charles Moule, another, notice how thin it is. See, I'm getting you nice small books. But Charles Moule has this book called The Origin of Christology, and that is also really good, especially his discussion of Jesus' claim to be the Son of Man. What's considered probably one of the best out there is this Studies in Early Christology by Martin Hengel. And just such a great book. A lot of amazing things in here, especially on Psalm 110 and hymns, ancient Christological hymns in the New Testament, but also his discussion of Jesus' claims to be the Son of Man are also unparalleled. And then this is another real popular theology book, The Christology of the New Testament. I'm seeing it backwards, so maybe you are too. So at least you're hearing what the title is. But Oscar Kuhlmann is this German scholar. He wrote this probably about 100 years ago now, but it's still just one of the most definitive books where he walks through all the titles of Jesus given to him in the New Testament, whether it be prophet or Lord or Christ or Messiah or Christ and Messiah or Son of Man. And so he has a whole chapter on the Son of Man that's really good. And then some that have already been mentioned, Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, is a great one to read to know the a view that's really a minority view in scholarship, but Bart Ehrman, because of his popularity, he has revived it, and the view basically that Jesus did speak about the Son of Man, but spoke about another coming figure that is distinct from himself. So he did talk about the Son of Man, but it was someone other than himself. And that's Bart Ehrman's view. But of course, if you read Bart Ehrman's How Jesus Became God, you have to read How God Became Jesus by my good friend, Dr. Michael Bird, the great New Testament scholar. And this is a direct response to Bart Ehrman's book. And he also has great discussions on the Son of Man. And then just two more. Notice now we're getting into real thickness, but we're talking about N.T. Wright's Jesus and the Victory of God. And we're talking about Raymond Brown's The Death of the Messiah. Both of these books have excellent discussions of everything, but specifically Jesus' claims, who he claimed to be, and everything about historical Jesus I think that you'd want to know you can get into in those books. So just some recommendations there at the beginning. Let me start also with a quote from this Jewish scholar, famous as a rabbinic scholar, Jewish scholar, rabbi himself. He actually has published over 500 books. There has to have been some ghostwriting going on in there, but he's considered one of the most published authors in all of history and one of the foremost leading scholars in Jewish rabbinic studies. And he wrote a book called A Rabbi Talks with Jesus, and it's by Jacob Neusner. And after he wrote that book, he did an interview, and he made this point about the claims of Jesus. He basically said, when I read that Jesus said things like, you have heard that it was said thus and so, but I say unto you this and this and this, I want to say to this Jesus, who do you think you are, God? Who do you think you are, God? And I really like that, because I think that is exactly the kind of response that specifically the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, want their readers to respond with. I think they want everyone who reads their Gospels to read the last sentence of their Gospels and say, "Who is this Jesus, God?" I think that nails that. And so hopefully by the end of this talk, you will be crying out like Neusner to Jesus, "Who do you think you are, God?" And I'm going to cover 3 key points in this talk. We're going to talk about, we're mainly looking at Jesus' claim to be the Son of Man. We could talk about other claims if you'd like, but this is what I'm focusing on. But basically the origin and understanding of this title, the Son of Man, in the book of Daniel, where it all began. The Son of Man figure in Second Temple Judaism, which basically, if you're not familiar with that term, basically just means all the writings we have, specifically by Jews, but others as well, between around 200 to 300 BC to around 200 AD. So that time frame covers what scholars call Second Temple Judaism. So, of course, the New Testament was written during that time, but also a ton of other writings before, during, and after the New Testament by Jews, by Christians, by even Greco-Roman writers as well. So how did they see the Son of Man during that time? And then, of course, the Son of Man as a divine title on the lips of Jesus himself, on the lips of Jesus of Nazareth. So that's what we're going to look at. I was talking to Jonathan, I think after I go through 1 and 2, because it's some information, I thought maybe I'll stop there and see if there are any questions, and then I'll go through the last one, and then we'll have questions at the end as well. So I think that's the way we're going to do that. But basically, scholars are in agreement. It's rare to find scholars in agreement on anything when it comes to controversial points in the Bible and New Testament a lot of times. But when it comes to the Son of Man, scholars are at least unanimously agreed upon that the Son of Man, the title, the phrase, the figure, its origin is Daniel chapter 7. It's in the book of Daniel. This is where it all began for all the things that would come later, all the writings and Jesus's claims and all the things that would be said about the Son of Man. It all goes back to this night vision that Daniel had as recorded in Daniel chapter 7. But that Daniel didn't get it from somewhere else. Scholars have completely debunked those few that have said that a long time ago. It is a Jewish idea, and it comes from the book of Daniel itself, and it comes from Daniel having this night vision. At least that is what he is claiming. That's where he saw this particular figure. But before we get to Daniel 7 and look at the actual text, let's think about the book of Daniel as a whole and just think about the context of Daniel 7. And the best way to do that without reading through it all, to keep it very simple, I want you to just see that Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 correspond with one another. And they're written in such a way that you're meant to interpret one in light of the other, because they basically follow the same pattern. And basically what both of them are teaching, whether it's Nebuchadnezzar's dream or Daniel's night visions in Daniel chapter 7, is that these beastly kingdoms of men, Daniel sees all these ferocious, hideous beasts, and they represent the different kingdoms of men. But those beastly kingdoms of men are going to give way to the eternal kingdom of God. And in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, you have this statue. And so the head of the statue represents the Babylonian Empire, the breast and arms represent Medo-Persian Empire, and on. And you have beasts that correspond to that statue that represent the same empires as before. But what's very interesting about both, about the dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and about the night visions in Daniel 7, is they both climax with 2 different figures. So in Daniel 2, it's this stone cut out of a mountain, which it says in the text, not by human hands, not by human agency. And then in Daniel 7, it is this Son of Man figure that is at the center of our discussion today. So this is the actual text from Daniel 2 about the stone. And by the way, the stone is very clearly representing the kingdom of God. So the kingdom of God that will not give way to another kingdom. It will last forever. So the Babylonian Empire rises and falls. The Grecian Empire rises and falls. The Roman Empire rises and falls. But the kingdom of God never ends. It rises and it never ends. So in Daniel chapter 2, it says, you continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, but it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And this parallels language from Isaiah and from the Psalms. The kingdom of God will one day be from sea to sea. It will reign over all the earth, and the fullness of the kingdom will go forth. And the stone here is the image that represents the kingdom of God. And as I said, the stone, the way the Nebuchadnezzar statue in that dream climaxes with the stone, similarly, the visions in Daniel climax with the Son of Man figure, talking about him being the one who rules over God's kingdom, which lasts forever and ever. And I thought some of y'all might find this very interesting. Josephus, the Jewish writer from the first century, writing contemporary. He was born a few years after Jesus died, but he was writing contemporary with a lot of our New Testament writers. So his interpretation of these passages is fascinating, and he actually brings up the stone, really to evade it, but he talks about Daniel a lot, and this is what he says about that passage in Daniel chapter 2, what we call Daniel chapter 2. They didn't have chapters back then. But he says, Daniel did also declare the meaning of the stone to the king, but I do not think proper to relate it, since I have only undertaken to describe things past or things present, but not things that are future. Yet if anyone be so very desirous of knowing the truth as not to give up such points of curiosity, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding the uncertainties of the future, and whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in the reading the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. Isn't that beautiful? So Josephus is, and Josephine scholars are in agreement on this, pretty much he understands the stone as, in a messianic way, as this one who will defeat, ultimately, the Roman Empire, because the fourth kingdom, even according to Josephus, is the Roman Empire. But remember where Josephus is. He is on the payroll of the Roman Empire, so he doesn't think it's probably the best thing to let the Roman Empire know that they're going to be destroyed one day by this Jewish Messiah. So he says, you know what? You just go read Daniel on your own. You know, it has something to say about the stone, but, let's just not talk about it right now. I don't think I want to mess with my salary for the Roman Empire. And unfortunately, he doesn't talk about the Daniel 7 passage. He doesn't talk about the Son of Man figure, but you can get kind of an idea, I think, from this, what he would say, and probably why he doesn't talk about the Son of Man figure, because he doesn't want to talk about the fact that the Holy Roman Empire is not going to last forever, as, of course, many Romans believed it would. So let's look at our key passage. This is the parallel passage to the stone passage in Daniel 7. And he says, I kept looking, Daniel speaking in the first person, he says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him, clearly talking about the Son of Man, to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Now, this is an incredible passage. Probably one of my favorites, one of the most amazing passages maybe in the entire Old Testament. And what is mainly mysterious about this passage is this Son of Man figure. The Ancient of Days isn't, because the Ancient of Days, even though this is unique to Daniel, God is nowhere else called the Ancient of Days in the Scriptures. But everyone agrees the Ancient of Days is the God of Israel. The Ancient of Days represents the God of Israel. But the Son of Man figure, and what Daniel means by the Son of Man when he says one like a son of man, what he basically means, wouldn't literally, is as he looked and saw this vision, this figure looked like a human. He looked like a human. That's what he means by one like a son of man. He looked like a human being, but he did things that a human being doesn't do. And that's what makes him so mysterious, because he's doing things that only the God of Israel should do. And he's receiving things that only the God of Israel should receive. And this is why, as far as I can tell, all the scholars I've read on Daniel and on these passages, this figure is at least divine. Now, there may be a spectrum of divinity that they would, some would follow. Some would say he's more of a semi-divine figure, more of an angelic figure, but some would even say he's being equated with God there in the text of Daniel. So there's a spectrum there, but everyone agrees he's divine. This figure is divine, and let me tell you why. The Son of Man here rides the clouds. Nobody rides the clouds in the Old Testament except for Yahweh, the God of Israel, except for here. This is the only exception in the Old Testament where someone is riding the clouds other than the God of Israel. He's also given glory, and all nations worship him. We'll talk about how significant that is in the context of the book of Daniel in a second. And then we're told he is the king over God's eternal kingdom. So he is the one that it says his rule, his dominion will never end, referring back to the Son of Man figure. Let's look at these individually. The Son of Man rides the clouds. Remember, Psalm 68, verse 4 is an example. Here's two examples where Yahweh, the God of Israel, rides the clouds. And as I said, it only is the God of Israel who's riding the clouds in the Old Testament. Sing to God, sing praise to his name, extol him who rides on the clouds. His name is the Lord, and rejoice before him. And Isaiah 19 says, an oracle concerning Egypt, see, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. The idols of Egypt tremble before him, and the hearts of the Egyptians melt within them. So, and I could add many other passages, but again, this is unique. And this passage in Daniel 7 is unique because here we have a figure that is riding the clouds that is not Yahweh. This is a divine prerogative to ride the clouds. And as I said on the second one, all nations here worship this Son of Man figure. Now think about the context of the book of Daniel already, how amazing that is and how crazy and shocking that is. What is the first 6 chapters of Daniel all about? It's all about the fact that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are going to stand their ground on monotheism and on the fact that they're not going to worship any creature, they're not going to worship any statue, they're not going to worship anyone but the God of Israel. He's the only one they're going to worship. So the book of Daniel, like the book of Isaiah and other books, it is as monotheistic and as strongly, we worship only one God. We don't worship anything else. Worshiping anything else would be idolatry. And yet it's in this same book that this other figure that is distinct from the Ancient of Days is worshipped by all nations, tribes, and tongues. Okay? And then the last one, the Son of Man is king of God's eternal kingdom. Now, again, this is significant within the context, within the book of Daniel itself. Because in Daniel chapter 4, verse 34, it says, this is Nebuchadnezzar praising the God of Israel. He says, then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. And if you notice, in the original language, it's identical. His dominion is an everlasting dominion to the dominion of this Son of Man figure. To him was given dominion, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So, a simple question would be, well, who's the king of the kingdom to come in the book of Daniel? Is it the Ancient of Days? Is it the God, the Most High, the God of Israel? Or is it the Son of Man figure? Both are said to be the ruler, the king, and in some sense, both are going to rule over this kingdom. That's what you're left with. You're left with ambiguity, but you're definitely left with the fact that both will rule over this kingdom. Now, what's interesting is the latter part of Daniel 7, you have the angel give an interpretation of the vision. And in the interpretation, when we get to the passage where the Son of Man would be mentioned, the Son of Man's at least alluded to, but it doesn't use the phrase one like a son of man again, because now we're getting the actual interpretation. And this is what it says at the end of Daniel 7. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. Notice the singular. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. We have an allusion to this Son of Man figure again. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming. My thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. Now, most Danielic scholars, if you just stick with scholars of Daniel, you go find all the top critical scholars and commentaries on Daniel, the vast majority of them are going to go with a certain interpretation of the Son of Man figure, which I agree with. They basically will say that the Son of Man figure in the vision of Daniel is a collective symbol, a representative of the saints of the Most High, meaning Israel in the context. But saints of the Most High, of course, could include more than just Israel because it's more ambiguous. But in the context of Daniel, saints of the Most High would be Israel. And I think that's right. I think the Son of Man does represent these people, the saints of the Most High, and that's why he's not mentioned again here in the interpretation. But just because he represents them doesn't mean that he cannot be a real divine figure in heaven, representing them as their king in heaven. Because what's interesting is that when you compare the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of the saints of the Most High with the other kingdoms that were mentioned, in every case, Babylonian, the Grecian kingdom, the Persian kingdom, you always have a king and their people. So there's Alexander the Great, or there's Nebuchadnezzar, who represents the kingdom. So then the representative here of the people of the Most High is given to us in Daniel chapter 7, which is this Son of Man figure. And that, again, is how all the Jews that we have writings from, as they commented on this text in Second Temple Judaism, this is how they read it. They read that this figure was a real figure in heaven, and that this figure was what they would then say is the Messiah. So they started equating the Son of Man figure with their ideas and concepts of the Messiah. Not all, but a lot of the writings we have about the Son of Man that we'll look at in a second, they started to equate the Son of Man figure as the Messiah and as this glorified divine being that is in the heavenlies and that sits on God's throne and on and on. But again, they still kept the Son of Man figure distinct from the God of Israel. And that's what we see going into the Second Temple references. So let me say a few words about what we have in the Second Temple Judaism, the Second Temple era, concerning the Son of Man figure. And the earliest reference we have, and really the most important one we have, that starts to talk about the Son of Man figure after the book of Daniel, and what some scholars would say, and I agree, is before the time of Jesus. So these ideas would have been before the time of Jesus, maybe contemporary, but at least contemporary, but probably before. And let me let Bart Ehrman explain this, because on this point we're in complete agreement. But he says in How Jesus Became God, this figure came to be known as the Son of Man, talking about the figure from Daniel 7. Nowhere is he described more fully than in the book of First Enoch. The Son of Man is a prominent figure in a different portion of the final edition of First Enoch, chapters 37 through 71, which are usually called the similitudes. There are debates about the date of the similitudes. Some scholars put this part of the book near the end of the first century, CE, meaning AD, probably more dated earlier to around the time of Jesus himself, which is how Bart Ehrman dates it. He says that this concept of this Son of Man figure was in the air of Judaism at the time of Jesus and before, and I agree as well. Now, what's very clear is First Enoch is getting its ideas about the Son of Man figure from Daniel 7. But again, because they're writing many hundreds of years later, and they're writing at a time when there's this messianic fervor, see, they start to equate this Son of Man figure with the Messiah. So they say more than just what was in Daniel 7. So we have statements like this given to the Son of Man figure. He is the elect one. He's the righteous and elect one. He's the Lord's Messiah. These references are from First Enoch. He's the light of the Gentiles. All the world will fall down before him. He sits on a throne of glory and holds judgment, and the righteous and the elect will have table fellowship and share life with him. And so equating the Son of Man with the Messiah, this is a kind of a huge step forward in the sense of development of an understanding among the Jews of this Son of Man figure. They now see the Son of Man figure as the Messiah. But notice, he's still as a divine figure as he can be, yet distinct from the God of Israel in some sense. And Bart Ehrman agrees here as well. I like what he says on page 67 and How Jesus Became God. He says, talking about the Son of Man figure, he is a divine being who has always existed, who sits beside God on his throne, who will judge the wicked and the righteous at the end of time. He, in other words, is elevated to God's own status and functions as the divine being who carries out God's judgment on the earth. This is an exalted figure indeed, as exalted as one can possibly be without actually being the Lord God Almighty himself. Couldn't say it better myself. That is exactly right. He is the most exalted figure outside of God himself, of all the figures, even the Messiah, of all who they equate him with, but of all the figures that are floating around in the ancient world, this Son of Man figure is the most exalted figure you can be without being, as he says, the Lord God Almighty himself, which I would say, without being God the Father. So you can imagine if some first century Jew, some Jewish carpenter, started walking around and claiming to be this particular figure, how blasphemous, how insane, how crazy that would be. We'll talk about that, unless, of course, he was telling the truth. But after First Enoch, you have a few references to the Son of Man figure in Jewish writings. That I'm not going to quote it, but Fourth Ezra is another example, more contemporary with the New Testament itself. But Fourth Ezra doesn't do much more. It just still equates him as the Messiah. It does call him God's son, but I think he's called God's son in First Enoch as well, maybe. But he flies with the clouds, and so this is basically all that we have on the Son of Man, contemporary with Christianity, the beginning of Christianity in the first century and before. The rabbis do take this up, and the rabbis, which most of their writings date hundreds of years later than the first century, so it's hard to know what they're saying that goes back to the first century. So that's why you have to be careful with rabbinic writings. But they do have a fascination with the Son of Man figure, and they talk about him a lot. In fact, they call him, they started calling their Messiah, their coming Messiah, as the Son of the Cloud. They call him the Son of the Cloud, or the Cloud Man. The Cloud Man. It sounds like a Marvel character, doesn't it? Sounds like he's going to join the Avengers. The Cloud Man. But they also said things like this. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi says, if Israel is meritorious, he will come with the clouds of heaven. Speaking about the Messiah, he will come with the clouds of heaven. If not, he will come lowly and riding upon an ass. I love that. He really understood the situation well, because that's exactly what happened. Israel was disobedient. They had rejected their Messiah. Jesus arrives on the donkey. And then, of course, when I believe the New Testament teaches there will be this massive conversion of Israel before Jesus returns, and then he will be coming with the clouds, with that imagery from Daniel 7. But it's interesting to see this rabbi writing. This dates to around 200 to 400 AD, but we don't know when he actually said that. But he could have said it really close to the time of the writing of the New Testament. But I like that. I find that very fascinating. But that's clearly an allusion to Daniel 7. So just to recap, the Son of Man figure is seen as a divine figure, not only in Daniel 7, but also in First Enoch and in these other Second Temple Judaism writings. He is still distinct from the God of Israel, but he's presented as this divine figure. And then he's equated with the Messiah and God's Son in a lot of these writings. But here's something that I didn't mention that's very interesting, that I think is very important for our discussion of the New Testament and how Jesus uses this. Is there's a book called The Two Powers of Heaven by Alan Siegel. And what he shows here is that there was this idea in Judaism. We don't know how far it goes back, because it's only in the rabbinical writings. Like I said, they were dated later. But some Jews early on, and I would bet maybe at the time of Jesus or before, they started looking at passages like Daniel 7, and they looked at the fact that they would use the phrase two powers in heaven, almost saying two gods in heaven. There are two gods of heaven. And when this is referenced in the rabbinical writings, it's rejected as heresy. But what's interesting is you see them struggling with a passage like Daniel 7 because of the divinity of the Son of Man figure. And because the Ancient of Days is distinct, how do you put this together? Well, the way some of them put it together was there are two powers in heaven that represent God, I guess. Interestingly, the New Testament writers, how do they put it together? Well, they put it together by not in any way saying there are two gods, but more in a binitarian way. At least early on in some of the early Paul's writings, we see him already equating the Son and the Father, and yet they're just one. They're still one God. And so I thought you'd find that interesting. But that's basically Daniel, the origin of the phrase in Daniel 7, and we have it how it's used in Second Temple Judaism. So we could take a little break right now and answer any questions if anybody has any questions or clarifications or comments.
Great. Anyone have any questions that they want to raise? If you have any questions, then you can raise your hand, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with Justin and ask your questions or make your comments, etc. Or if not, I will ask questions myself because I have some thoughts. Brian has had his hand up for a while. I'm not sure if he wants to come up. I'll bring Brian up. Brian, did you want to say something?
Yes, can you hear me, Jonathan?
We can hear you.
Justin, when Jesus was interrogated by the Sanhedrin before the crucifixion, and he makes mention that you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory, was this understanding that you're speaking about in the minds of the high priest at the time, that one riding on the clouds of glory is someone that's likened to God?
It's an excellent question. If my view, and Bart Ehrman is and others who argue that those passages in Enoch, there's debate on when to date those. If you date, the latest they can be dated is like the end of the 1st century. So if that's when they were written, then you don't have that clear, Son of Man figure like First Enoch is talking about. You don't have that idea floating around the 1st century as clearly as it would if it was written before that. If it was written before that or contemporary with it, then they probably did have that idea. Now, I think for sure, at least they understood Jesus's claim to be some sort of divine claim there, probably from Daniel 7, but also because he speaks about sitting at the right hand. We're going to talk about that passage at the end of this talk, so we'll get back into that. But I think the fact that they cry blasphemy and he rips his garments, I think that shows that he knew that he had an understanding that what Jesus was saying, what Jesus was claiming, he was definitely claiming to be the Son of Man, and by claiming that and the other things he said, he was making a divinely prerogative claim.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Does anyone else have any comments or questions that they would like to raise? If not, I have some things I would bring up. We have a hand from Linda. Let me promote Linda. Greetings, Linda.
Hello, it's me, James. The computer still thinks.
Okay.
Yes. Just wondering, Justin, what date of Daniel are you positing in the background here?
The date of the book of Daniel?
Yeah, the composition date.
Yeah, I do think that the main heart of the book of Daniel goes back to Daniel himself, and I would think that I think there was editing and different things that went on over the centuries with Daniel, and definitely things that went on that probably certain stories were fitting with the Antiochus rebellion, the Antiochus Epiphanes, and what was going on in the Maccabean revolt. But I do think that the heart of what's being taught and the visions and things are going back to Daniel himself. But I don't think that whether Daniel is dated to around 200 BC, which is where a lot of scholars would date it today, or whether it goes back to the early 500s, which is where it'd have to be if Daniel had any part in it. Either way, you have the Son of Man figure well before Jesus and well before First Enoch. So it wouldn't affect much of whether you put the dating late or early. I don't think it affects the main arguments about this particular phrase.
And just to make sure, you're defining Daniel as a 12 chapter book, right? No apocryphal parts.
Yes, the 12 chapter book.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks. Question.
Let's see. Any more questions from the floor at this point? If you have a question, then you can raise your hand. There's a question in the Q&A box. Someone asked, Kenneth asked, is there a good collection of primary source documents on pre-Christian Jewish Messianic theology?
Say that again.
Is there a good collection of primary source documents on pre-Christian Jewish Messianic theology?
I can't think of that specifically just focus on Messianic references, but your best bet for getting all these documents would be James Charlesworth in his Old Testament pseudepigrapha, which way's right. But this is 2-volume, and this is where you get First Enoch and a lot of the keynotes on First Enoch. But basically, this and another volume, these 2 volumes cover all of the Second Temple Judaism writings that go during that time period that aren't the Old Testament books and that aren't the apocryphal books or deuterocanonical books, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, depending on how you title that. But so it doesn't include those books. So books like First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, those aren't in there, and it doesn't include, of course, the Old Testament books, but it includes all the others. So it has First Enoch, it has Apocalypse of Abraham, it has the Syllabine Oracles, it has all these other writings. So that's where you're going to get, and then a lot of those writings will have these messianic references that we talk about, and he'll have a little discussion before each book. Whatever scholar goes through each book, they'll have a little discussion at the beginning, the date of it, like when it was written, and it'll talk about like key passages, like messianic passages for sure.
Great. We had a question from Josh Parikh from Oxford University. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Justin.
Hey, good, sir.
How you doing?
Good. How you doing?
Good. I'm well. Yeah, I haven't got a lot of interest to say because this is not my area at all, and I don't know Greek or Hebrew or anything. But yeah, I think I'd have a couple of questions. So the first one I'd say, what would you say to people who? So I know that there's talk of a kind of mediated Christology and things like kind of demigods in first century Judaism, and I think two of the people that I maybe am and talking about this, there's another guy, the guy who's on with Borkham on Unbelievable, who's good. No, not by him. And so before that he did 2 shows on Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and is James someone?
Crossley.
Crossley, there we are. Okay. Crossley, and he talks about that there are kind of demigod style figures. What would you say to people who said that perhaps the Son of Man is that kind of figure? It may be kind of not the right era of that kind of thing. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say outside of the New Testament, without the New Testament, that's very possible. Okay. So I would say just left with what the Old Testament tells us in Daniel 7 and the Second Temple Judaism writings about the Son of Man figure in First Enoch and these writings. I would say they're probably struggling to figure out who the Son of Man figure is, and they're wanting to, give him that great exaltation and all that. But I would say if I could get next to the guy whoever wrote First Enoch or those passages, that Jew who wrote those, and if I said, is the Son of Man equal to God Almighty? My bet would be he would say no. Okay. He probably didn't think so. So I would say without the New Testament, the Son of Man figure does kind of fit. He's definitely more exalted than any of the others. He's given attributes that none of the others are given, kind of collectively. And so he stands out even as that. But I would still say, yeah, he could fit in that mode. But I would then say, but in the New Testament, when Paul, when the gospel writers, Hebrews and others, when they equate Jesus with the Son of Man and then explain who Jesus is, they're putting Jesus not on the side of the demigods and the angels and all the others, which I completely agree, they're all there. They put Jesus on the side of the Creator and the one who's absolutely sovereign and the one God. And so if you think of it as a line between that, no matter who's writing, they always had that line between, when we're talking about Jewish writing, I'm not talking about
Right.
Greek and Roman writers. I'm talking about just Jewish writers. They would have that line between the one true God and then everything else. And they put Jesus, the New Testament writers put Jesus on the side of the one true God.
Okay.
And so even guys like Philo, who is thoroughly Hellenized and as Greek as you can be, and he talked about all the divine men and Logos and all the rest. No matter what, Philo still, if you look at a lot of things he says, he'll go out of his way to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not saying he's the same as God Almighty though. God Almighty still stands on his own. God Almighty is alone. There's only one, and it's God Almighty. And so for the New Testament writers who believe, just like Philo, just like Josephus, that there's absolutely one God, but they put Jesus on that side of that one God. And how they do that, so that's when you get into all the how to put that together.
Okay. Given that, so when in Mark 14:62, 61 to 3:64, that kind of classic, but you'll know, you mentioned it. So what is it then particularly that you think, so if it could be kind of 50-50 without the New Testament, why is it then that you've probably gone over this, and it's probably my misunderstanding rather than your clarity, but why is it then that when Jesus says, you shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, seating the right hand of power, why is that then identifying himself as Yahweh rather than identifying himself as a demigod? Is it the kind of response from the Sanhedrin, or is it the kind of Psalm 110 reference, or is it possibility that it's a reference back to Exodus 3:14? Kind of what would you say?
I think it's all of it together, but again, what is in the mind of like the high priest? Now the high priest definitely thinks it's blasphemous. But does the high priest think that Jesus is claiming to be Yahweh in the flesh? I don't know about that, but he definitely thinks that this man, Jesus, that's what's unique about the situation with Jesus, is this is the only time we have a human being claiming these things, right? So it's different than the other writings we have where they'll maybe exalt a figure like Abraham or Enoch or something like that. But these are people who lived, thousands of years before of the time that they're writing. With Jesus, we're talking about a man who's just there, who's a contemporary, who's walking among them, and he's saying he's these things. So how far they took it as far as his equating his claim to be the same as Yahweh himself, I'm not for sure on their mindset on that, but that they thought he was making claims that no human being should ever make. Okay. That he could sit at the right hand of God, that he is that Son of Man figure who, as Erman says, is the most exalted figure that's even talked about in ancient Judaism other than God. That's what I think is so blasphemous in their eyes.
So this couldn't possibly be like, oh, I'm like a really high prophet of God, that this is kind of ridiculously above that, and it's that.
Well, there'd be no parallel. There'd be no parallel if it was.
No parallel at all. Okay, that's cool. That's useful. In terms of discussion of, so what would you, that I'm not, because I'm not huge, I've kind of got, I know bits about New Testament studies and have read bits in there, but in terms of Daniel commentaries, what good evangelical Daniel commentaries can you recommend?
Probably Gleason Archer is still one of the best for Daniel to really to defend the early date the early dating. Can't remember, early and late gets confusing before BC, but that Daniel actually wrote it, and he and Gleason Archer knew the languages like no other, so he shows how the language of the Hebrew in Daniel fits well with 5th century inscriptions and things like that. So he's still one of the best. But the Word Biblical Commentary, I don't know if you heard of that, but that's a series that is more moderate conservative, sometimes more liberal, depending on the author. But the guy that did that one, the Word Biblical Commentary on Daniel, that's an excellent one. And he basically argues kind of what I had said to a previous question, that he believes it's sourced. He believes most of Daniel is sourced in the actual Daniel, but it went through stages of editing and
kind of like redaction and redaction, a bit like kind of Raymond Brown on John.
Exactly.
Right, fine. That makes sense. I'm trying to think if I got anything else of interest to say. Probably not. But yeah, well, thanks very much.
Well, great questions. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Josh. It's interesting also to note that the trial narrative in Mark 14, Jesus combines the Son of Man phraseology with with the Psalm 110 seating at the right hand of God. So he's claiming to share the throne of Yahweh. And if you look back at Psalm 110, we read that Yahweh is speaking to one identified as Adoni, the possessive form of the Hebrew Adon, which means Lord, which isn't necessarily a divine title. But if you look later in the same chapter, in verse 5, it actually identifies the one seated at Yahweh's right hand as Adonai. Now, obviously, the Masoretic vowel pointing that distinguishes those terms Adoni and Adonai developed much later, because the Masoretics were only around the 7th, 9th centuries, which is when that the diacritical marks came into being. But it's interesting that that's the way that they interpreted it at that point. And verses 6 and 7, I think, can only be associated with someone who is Yahweh. So that's interesting. And it's interesting also in relation to the trial narrative that in Mark 14, when Jesus says, "I am, and you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and come in the clouds of heaven." Mm-hmm. According to the Jewish Mishnah and Sanhedrin 7:5, when a post-trial report would replace the blasphemous divine name, the mentioning of the divine name, which is blasphemy, with a substitute for it, such as the power, which is interesting that it corresponds in that way to the later idealization of Jewish jurisprudence concerning capital blasphemy cases.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, great point.
One question I wanted to ask is that John J. Collins is a well-known scholar who's written on the Book of Daniel.
Yeah,
has pointed out, and he's not the only person to have taken note of this, that there are certain literary parallels that exist between the Son of Man vision of Daniel 7 and the Canaanite Baal myth. So, for example, you have Baal referred to frequently as rider of the clouds, which resembles the manner in which, in Daniel's vision, the Son of Man was seen to come on the clouds of heaven. And moreover, the high god El is depicted as an aged deity who is often referred to as the father of years, similar to the title ascribed to Yahweh in Daniel 7, which is the Ancient of Days. The Son of Man is also portrayed in Daniel 7 as being in subordination to the Ancient of Days, which also parallels the Canaanite myth in which Baal, the subordinate deity, receives kingship from the high god El following the defeat of the god Yam in battle. And Yahweh, the God of Israel, is described as the title of Cloud Rider on several occasions in the Old Testament, as you alluded to already in Isaiah 19:1 and Deuteronomy 33:26, and so on, Psalm 104 verse 3. And the biblical prophets seem to have taken this title, which is a title that was widely recognized as an official title of Baal, and applied it to Yahweh in some capacity.
Definitely.
And the fact that the Son of Man is described as the Cloud Rider is also suggests that he's being identified with Yahweh.
That's right.
I mean, what do you think of the manner in which the author of Daniel seems to borrow from the Canaanite Baal myth and kind of gives it a new dimension, a new meaning?
Yeah, I think we see this all throughout, even in the New Testament, but all throughout the Old Testament, as far as God using the imagery and language of the day to show his superiority, to show whether it's the gods of Egypt or the Canaanite gods, or the way Paul or John will refer to Logos, or refer to use certain language that would show how Jesus is greater than Caesar, or other gods of the Greco-Roman Empire. But even John Collins, though, in his Hermenia, though, he does say, though, that because that imagery would have been still Old Testament imagery, because the author of Daniel would have still had the Psalms, they would have still had all the rest. So even if you go back to the Psalms, or you go back to some of those passages in Deuteronomy or something, and there you have maybe parallels with Canaanite deities and things to show Yahweh's superiority, Collins still argues that the origin of the Son of Man figure is first in Daniel, and it's Jewish in nature. The whole idea is Jewish. But I agree that the parallels that go back to Psalms, that go back to the other places in the Old Testament, could have other parallels outside of Israel.
Right. Because Jeroboam's religion had borrowed from Baal worship,
Right.
and it may have begun to look to so many of the Jews that there was no real difference between Baal and the God of Israel, and so it shouldn't therefore be so surprising that the prophets at times counted on the familiarity with Baal to present their argument that it was in fact Yahweh, not Baal, who was the king of heaven. Because the Israelites started to give credit to, because we see credit given to Baal, for example, for the crop cycle and so on, when that should go to Yahweh.
Right.
So, and also, of course, you have 1 Kings 17, where we have the sort of contest between Yahweh and Baal, which is observed by Elijah and the prophets of Baal, in which Yahweh is clearly demonstrated as being superior to Baal.
Mm-hmm.
Another point on Daniel 7 is that it uses the Greek word latruo in the Septuagint version, which is only ever used to apply to one who is Yahweh. It's never used to denote any other form of worship. It's the very highest form of worship and religious service. Yeah. And the Aramaic...
that's where we get the word liturgy.
Yeah. The Aramaic that's used in the original Pelach is, as far as I'm aware, not used of anyone besides Yahweh either. So that also suggests that we're dealing with one who is in fact Yahweh. One of the common Jewish rabbinic interpretations of Daniel 7 is that it's referring to the nation of Israel. I know Rabbi Tobias Singer, for example, takes that view, and other Jewish rabbis, at least in our modern period, although that wasn't the mainstream position back in times past.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like more modern scholars of Daniel, John Collins would be a distinct one. John Collins actually takes the Son of Man as being Michael the Archangel, which I think is ridiculous. But he's completely in the minority. But the majority of Danielic scholars today would say the Son of Man figure represents collectively the people of Israel, or the people of the Saints Most High. But I'm fine with that. I just think it doesn't go far enough. And if you just take it one step further, where he doesn't just represent them, but he's also their king, he is their representative as king, just like Nebuchadnezzar was of the Babylonian Empire, or Alexander of the Grecian Empire. That's how the ancient Jews took it, because the ancient Jews that wrote on this, that's how they're taking it. They're taking it as the passages I'm talking about that are pre-Christian. Now, Tobias Singer there might be passages in the rabbinical writings, but again, the rabbinical writings are 200, 300 years after the first century. So it's hard to know what in there goes back to pre-70 AD ideas.
Yeah, and the beasts actually spoken of in Daniel 7, the four beasts are spoken of in Daniel's vision, actually, although they represent four kingdoms, which is the exegetical argument. Well, since the four beasts are four kingdoms, Son of Man must also be a kingdom. But these great beasts, as we're told of in verse 17 of Daniel 7, are four kings. So the nations are actually represented by four kings.
Exactly.
Rise out of the earth. And so each of the kingdoms,
that's what I'm saying. It's kingdom and king. It's both. The image is for both.
Right. And also the sort of representation is also seen in Daniel 2:38, where Nebuchadnezzar is identified as the golden head of the statue in his vision. And so he thereby represents the entire kingdom of Babylon. And also in Psalm 110, the Messiah is identified as someone who serves in a priestly capacity, after the order of Melchizedek. So the role of the priest is to represent the people of God as well. And also, as you alluded to, about when it refers to the saints of the Most High in verse 27, the kingdom and the power and the greatness of the kings who are under the whole heaven were given to the saints of the Most High. And then it says, and his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. That's referring back to the Most High. And in the singular, it's referring to the Most High, and it's clearly an allusion also to the Son of Man. And I think it's plausible there that the Son of Man is thus being identified as the Most High, which would be Yahweh as well.
Yeah, that's very possible. Definitely. It has the same parallel.
Yeah, exactly.
It parallels it.
Let's take one more question just now. We have James wants to come back on. Hey, you're back on.
Hey, James.
Great. Yes, just real quick, while we're in Daniel. Daniel 3:25, in the fiery furnace. Angel or theophany?
Yeah, it's a hard one. At least in the text itself, it does call him an angel. Where is it? Yeah, right here. In verse 28, it said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel. But just because it calls him his angel, and remember, angel in the Hebrew, just like in the Greek, can mean messenger. So it is interesting that he sees him as one like a son of the gods. He looks like like a son of the gods. So I'm definitely open to it. You don't have, unfortunately, you don't have the New Testament give its kind of stamp of approval to say that this is a pre-incarnate vision of Christ, but I think it's definitely possible.
Okay. Let's see. Any final questions before we move on? Going once, going twice. Okay, do you want to continue, Justin?
Okay. So skipping ahead to the first century, you have, like I said, you have this man. You have this man named Jesus of Nazareth who comes on the scene, and all the evidence that we have about what he said shows that this phrase, this title, the Son of Man, is his favorite title to refer to himself. This is his favorite way of referring to himself as he speaks to his disciples, as he speaks to the crowds, as he speaks to the Jewish leadership. No matter who it is, this is his favorite title. In fact, Jesus refers to himself 81 times in the four Gospels as the Son of Man. And the phrase Son of Man only occurs 86 times total in the New Testament. So that means, for all you math majors, that means that five times out of the 86 times is the Son of Man not found on the lips of Jesus. So what did Jesus mean when he said the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, or the Son of Man has authority over the Sabbath, or the Son of Man is going to be rejected and crucified and raised again, or the Son of Man will come with the clouds? What did he mean by that? Well, we need to go back to the actual words Jesus used, and this is what scholars do. And so they don't just go to the Greek. The Greek's not good enough, because Greek is again a translation when we're dealing with Jesus, because most scholars agree, even if Jesus might have spoke some Greek to soldiers and different things, he and his disciples would have spoken primarily Aramaic. And when Jesus uses the phrase, the Son of Man, he would have used either of these two phrases, bar anash or bar anashah. These are the two phrases he would have used in Aramaic. The first one means a Son of Man. So it's more of a generic without the article. So it's like a Son of Man, meaning a human being or a man. The second one is more definite. It's saying the Son of Man. Okay? But even that one could mean more of a generic idea, more of a generic man or mankind. So here's the three main views from scholars on how to understand this phrase. Everyone agrees that Jesus used this phrase, one of the two. Everyone agrees he said Son of Man in some way. What did he mean by it? That's where the debate begins. And these are the three main options for us on what Jesus meant. So the first one is that when he said the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, it's the same thing as saying, I have no place to lay my head. So it's a way of just a generic self-reference. So he's just referring to himself as a human, and that's just the way people talk. People wouldn't say, I'm going somewhere. They would say, a Son of Man is going somewhere. So it was just a way of talking. And this is what a scholar named Maurice Casey and a Jewish scholar named Geza Vermesh, this is what they have popularized, and they have argued. Now others, like Bart Ehrman, but this is really an idea that kind of fell away out of scholarship, that Bart Ehrman has more revived. The second option is Jesus did talk about the Son of Man, talking about the divine figure from Daniel 7. But he talked about him as a distinct figure from himself. So he talked about the Son of Man. Jesus actually did talk about the Son of Man, but he said that the Son of Man's going to come in the future to bring God's kingdom. And that's, again, like I said, you can read Bart Ehrman's discussion of that in How Jesus Became God. He goes into detail of that one. And then the third option, which is what I will argue, which is what Raymond Brown and Martin Hengel and still a lot of formidable scholars would argue for, is that the historical Jesus did claim to be this particular Son of Man figure from Daniel, that he used and really even developed. He expanded on the idea, of course, but he started with that figure from Daniel as who he was and dealing with his vocation and his ministry and what he would do. So the Son of Man figure, in a sense, defined the way Jesus approached his mission and what he would do. And so, basically, he claimed to be the Son of Man. He did claim to be this particular Son of Man figure. Now let me show you why the third option is most persuasive. One point, thinking on the two phrases, bar anash or bar anashah, what's interesting about the phrase used in the New Testament, as I said, 81 times on the lips of Jesus. What's fascinating about that phrase in Greek is it's unparalleled. Nowhere do we have that Greek phrase used anywhere else in any literature at all. So this phrase, the Son of Man, that's how it's used in the Greek. That is a very strange phrase. And what most people think is that what the number 2 and number 3, both of the scholars on the number 2 and number 3 options, they would say Jesus must have said bar anashah when he said these things, because he said it in such a way that it was like a title. He wasn't just saying I, or I as a man am going to do this. He said that Son of Man, referring back to the Danielic Son of Man of Daniel 7. So not just the Son of Man, but that Son of Man. So when he's used that phrase, when he spoke that way, he used the definite article. That's what the Greek phrase demands. The Greek phrase makes no sense if Jesus said it the other way. If Jesus said it the other way, you wouldn't have such a strange Greek phrase. In fact, you wouldn't even need it. You could just put, the word ego for I, because it just would mean the same thing. But the New Testament writers are consistent. The gospel writers are consistent. They always say the Son of Man, which demands an Aramaic vorlog, an Aramaic, the phrase that they translated from that Jesus must have said was the Son of Man. He said the Son of Man, or some even have translated as that Son of Man. So let's look at something Bart Ehrman said. This is in his Apocalyptic Prophet for the New Millennium. And basically making the argument from number 2, like I said, that Jesus did use this phrase. And so he says, the assumption is that if no one else used Son of Man as a title in this way, Jesus wouldn't have either. This kind of assumption strikes me not only as unreflective, but also as demonstrably false. The fact is that there are lots of places in our tradition, independently attested all over the map, that Jesus himself does use the phrase in this way, as a title for a future cosmic judge from heaven. Someone coined the phrase. It'd be pretty bizarre to think that it couldn't have been Jesus, the one to whom all of these sayings are attributed in independent sources, or someone living before him. So close. Bart Ehrman is so close here. I mean, really, really close to the truth here. Because he's saying Jesus did say this title. He did, while he walked around Galilee and Jerusalem, he talked about the Son of Man. Ehrman is completely right. He talked about the Son of Man. But where Ehrman goes downward is he says, but he was talking about someone else. He was referring to someone distinct from himself. Even though he did talk about the Son of Man, he didn't say he was that Son of Man. And that's where someone like Raymond Brown makes clear. He says that Jesus did use the title of a future figure who would come to judge, but that this figure was not Jesus himself has lost much of its following. Granted, Jesus' conception of the role he himself was playing in making present the rule of God, his anticipation of another unidentified human-like figure to bring the work to a conclusion seems unlikely. And I can give you many other examples of New Testament scholars who would say the same. And just so you know, Bart Ehrman, in his book, When Jesus Became God, calls Raymond Brown the greatest New Testament scholar of the second half of the 20th century. And he says this idea is bunk in a way. This idea has lost a lot of its following. People don't argue this anymore, and there's many good reasons for that, which I'll show you. In fact, let me put this quote from Bart Ehrman next to that document. So this is what Jonathan will send you if you ask for it. This is the handout I sent everyone. So this is all the sayings of the Son of Man in the New Testament. Remember I said there's 86 of them. All but 5 of them are on the lips of Jesus. And I want you to see how they break down. Notice how these sayings are in Mark, and they have their parallels in Matthew and Luke, who I would say used Mark. So these don't count as separate ones because they are using the same. But notice they're in Q. Q is a hypothetical source, but I think it's real, that Matthew and Luke used sayings of Jesus that Matthew and Luke used independent of each other that are not found in Mark. And notice all throughout Q, we have Son of Man sayings. M is sayings in Matthew of Jesus that are only in Matthew. They're not in Luke, they're not in Mark, they're not in John. L the same way. L are sayings in Luke that are only in Luke. They're not in Mark, they're not in Matthew, they're not in John. And then John, of course, are just John. But notice how Jesus' sayings cover all these sayings, all these strata of sources we have for Jesus in the New Testament. Look what Bart Ehrman says about the sources. When establishing historically authentic tradition from the Gospels, we're looking for lots of independently attested sayings and deeds. I should add here that in particular, we're looking for such independently attested traditions from our earliest sources. John is the last of the Gospels to be written, some 60 to 65 years after Jesus lived. The Synoptic Gospels are earlier, and the sources of the Synoptics are even earlier than the Synoptics. If we find traditions independently attested in, say, Mark, our earliest Gospel, in, say, Q, the source of parts of Matthew and Luke, and M and L, then we have early independent traditions, and that is as good as it gets. Don't miss that. That is as good as it gets. I'm giving you here, with the Son of Man sayings of Jesus, as Bart Ehrman says, it's as good as it gets. And again, he agrees. See, Bart Ehrman doesn't go against his own logic here. He agrees Jesus is using the Son of Man saying. What he then does is he says he is using the Son of Man saying, look, it's all in the traditions. We have it in all the sources. He had to have been talking about the Son of Man figure. But he wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about somebody else. And the biggest problem with that is you basically have to go through these sayings that I'm showing you here with scissors and cut what you don't like out arbitrarily. And that's what Bart Ehrman does in his book. When he goes through why he decides what Jesus said and what he doesn't, it is completely arbitrary. And so that is the biggest problem with the idea that Jesus is referring to someone else, because he's clearly referring to himself in vast majority of those passages. And Ehrman, guess what Ehrman does with those passages? He says those have just been added later by the early church. So it is kind of a scholarship of convenience when it comes to that. Now, if the early church invented this title at all, then why do we not see it used anywhere except on the lips of Jesus? This is an example where we see the early church being careful with history. We see the early church, and what I mean by the early church is these writers of the Gospels, these writers of the New Testament. They're being careful with how they portray what Jesus actually said. And let me give you examples to show you with comparisons with Jesus' other titles. This is where the Son of Man title really shines, and let me show you why. Notice that Christ, which means Messiah, same thing. Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. In the Gospels, all 4 Gospels, Jesus refers to himself as the Christ or Messiah 7 times. And I'm being generous there. If you look at those examples, they're ambiguous. You know, it's places where he says, what do you think of the Christ? Whose son is he? I mean, it's ambiguous statements about the Christ, okay? But in the New Testament, if you count how many times the books of the New Testament, the authors of the New Testament call Jesus the Christ, it's over 533 times, okay? Lord, same kind of thing. Only 5 times in the Gospels does Jesus call himself Lord, and again, it's ambiguous. It's mainly those passages dealing with Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord. You know, Jesus is asking that question about that. But notice in the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament call Jesus Lord over 540 times in the New Testament. Now watch this compared to the Son of Man sayings. When it comes to the Son of Man sayings, Jesus calls himself the Son of Man 81 times in the Gospels. But in the rest of the New Testament, he's only called the Son of Man 5 times. 5 times. Notice that disparity. What is going on here? Let me give you one more example, and I'll explain more. When you think of Luke and Acts, everyone agrees, scholars agree, everyone agrees that whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts. Whether it was actually Luke or not, that's debated, of course, but the author who wrote Luke also wrote Acts. Everyone agrees on that. Now watch how the titles of Jesus are used in Luke and Acts. When it comes to the Christ or the Messiah, Jesus is only refers to himself as the Christ once, and again, it's ambiguous, in Luke chapter 20. In Acts, in the book of Acts, when after Jesus dies, rises again, and ascends into heaven, in the book of Acts, Jesus is called the Christ 24 times. Same thing with Lord. Jesus only refers to himself as Lord once, ambiguously, in Luke chapter 20. But in Acts, he's called the Lord 78 times. What's my point? You see, I hope you're seeing my point here. They're very careful here, because if they just wanted to make up that Jesus called himself Lord all the time, they could have done it. Why didn't they have Jesus in the Gospels themselves when he's walking around Galilee, going around saying, I am Lord? The Lord says this. The Lord does this. They don't do that. Jesus must not have called himself the Lord. He must not have gone around saying, I'm the Christ or the Lord. He didn't do that. They carefully distinguish between what Jesus said and what the Christians said about him in the book of Acts afterwards. But notice how it's different with the Son of Man. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man 25 times in Luke. But in the book of Acts, he's called the Son of Man just once. And that's by Stephen as he's being martyred. And so one scholar, Joachim Jeremias, this German scholar, says it, I think, perfectly. He says, it is remarkable that in all 4 Gospels, the title occurs exclusively on the lips of Jesus. Here, the tradition is quite consistent. The title Son of Man does not occur in any confessional formula of the early church. How did it come about that at a very early stage, the community avoided the title, the Son of Man, and did not use it in a single confession, yet at the same time, handed it down in the sayings of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels virtually as the only title used by Jesus of himself? There can only be one answer. The title was rooted in the tradition of the sayings of Jesus right from the beginning. As a result, it was sacrosanct, and no one dared eliminate it. This was almost like it was Jesus' special title. It was his own unique title that he was going to use for himself, and nobody touched it. Nobody else used it, but yet at the same time, they made sure and kept it in the tradition, in the stories where Jesus actually taught. So they didn't go, think about it this way. If they put all these Son of Man sayings that I showed you, the 81 sayings on the lips of the historical Jesus, then why don't they have the apostles, and why don't any of the Christians in the early church go around calling him the Son of Man? I hope you see how crazy this is, and why scholars, even more liberal scholars, will say Jesus must have been talking about the Son of Man. He must have been referring to him because of this disparity when you compare the other titles of Jesus. In the end, we're on incredibly solid ground historically that this title goes back to Jesus himself. And I would say, unless you just be completely arbitrary and, like I said, go through and cut with scissors things that you just think, oh, well, this doesn't fit what I think about Jesus, so then I have to take it out. But if you take the saying seriously, no matter how much, if you go to the earliest sayings, whatever you do, you're going to get Jesus claiming to be the Son of Man. He is referring to himself because he says many times, the Son of Man will suffer, the Son of Man will be crucified, and things like that. So let's look at a few Son of Man sayings. So Mark 2, these three are very similar. They're kind of, scholars distinguish three kinds of Son of Man sayings with Jesus. There's the more earthly Son of Man sayings, things he said while he was on earth. There's the Son of Man sayings about his suffering and his death and his resurrection. And then there's the Son of Man sayings about his coming in glory, about his coming in judgment and as the eschatological judge. So let me just give you a few examples of each of these. So these are more the earthly Son of Man sayings. So that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, get up, pick up your pallet, and go home. And I won't get into it, but just the divine prerogative of forgiving sins. I mean, nobody can forgive sins but God alone. They say that in the text, but it's said clearly in the book of Isaiah and other places. Only God forgives sins. But here Jesus is saying, your sins are forgiven. But he says, as the Son of Man, your sins are forgiven. And then, of course, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. It seems like a nothing statement, but the Sabbath was one of the biggest, like circumcision, it was one of the biggest issues in Judaism at that time, and that only God has authority over the Sabbath. But here he says the Son of Man has authority over the Sabbath. And then Jesus said, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, showing the true opposite extreme from what we see in Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, we see the Son of Man glorified, exalted, reigning over God's kingdom and all the nations, and everyone's worshiping him. Here, the Son of Man doesn't even have a place to lay his head. He's homeless, right? And I just had to put this in here because I love it, because somebody mentioned the Jesus Seminar. So the 5 Gospels, Robert Funk, they add the Gospel of Thomas as the 5th Gospel. And the Jesus Seminar, if you're not familiar with them, these scholars got together and they decided by colored beads which sayings of Jesus were legitimate and which were just made up by the gospel writers. And in the end, they only accept about 18% of all the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels. They only accept 18% as said by Jesus. And just so you know, these two bottom ones, they accept as authentic. These two, right? Mark 2:28 and Matthew 8:20. They accept these as authentic to Jesus. And here's their little commentary on it, which I thought was really good, actually. It says, if Jesus is referring to himself, as some scholars think, the saying suggests that Jesus is homeless, a wanderer without permanent address. His disciples may have imitated him in this regard. The contrast is thus between the animals of the field and the birds of the skies, which have their dens and nests on the one hand, and the human vagabonds of Jesus' type on the other. Jesus' lifestyle places him below the animals and therefore at even greater remove from ordinary civilized persons who have permanent homes. Jesus warns a prospective follower that discipleship entails a homeless existence. The 2 sayings preserved by Matthew were accorded strong red and pink votes. I just really like that. Jesus warns a prospective follower that discipleship entails a homeless existence. Maybe Creflo Dollar needs to listen to the Jesus Seminar, or at least even better, listen to what Jesus actually said. But the sayings of the Son of Man, suffering and dying, he talks about how the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected and be killed and on the 3rd day rise again. You can imagine how this is why the disciples were so confused, right? I mean, if they had the idea of this Son of Man figure floating in their mind, to talk about the Son of Man figure suffering and dying and rising again, I mean, this would have been just, gobbledygook. I mean, how would they have understood this? Because this is unique. There was no discussion of the Son of Man dying and suffering and rising again. This is absolutely unique to the sayings of Jesus. And again, whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels. And this is a very important one. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Most scholars think that Jesus is here, especially if he said this, he is equating not equating, but he is uniting in his person the Son of Man figure from Daniel 7 and the servant of Yahweh from Isaiah 40 through 55, Isaiah 53 primarily. Because in both the first part and the second part allude to those passages. Notice the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Remember the passage in Daniel 7. Remember what it said? all nations, all peoples will worship and serve him. But yet here he says, I've come not to be served, but to serve. And then he says to give his life as a ransom for many. And see, that then takes the suffering servant who dies for the sins of Israel in Isaiah 53. And so here you have the Son of Man who's in glory, who sits on God's throne, who rules over God's kingdom, and the suffering servant united in this man Jesus. He's going to fulfill both of them in his ministry. And the last one we've talked about already, but this is so significant because this is really the climactic statement of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. Mark is clearly designed leading up to really showing who Jesus is by what he does more than what he says in Mark. But here's where Jesus really says who he is. And you have the high priest question him. He says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus says, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And as we said, he's wedding here now the Son of Man imagery from Daniel 7, which is already a divine figure, as we said. And then the Adonai, who's seated at the right hand of Yahweh. And so what's fascinating about this, see, this gets into our, if we were to talk about the seeds of the Trinitarian doctrine, because how does Jesus, if let's say what I believe, but let's say hypothetically that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, or Jesus is the Son of God. He is fully God, but yet distinct from the Father. How is Jesus going to explain that while he's on earth? How is he going to claim himself as God without saying, I'm the Father, without confusing people, thinking that he's the God of Israel, and now the Father's been taken out? The way Jesus does that is by referring to himself as the Son of Man figure, as Adonai at the right hand of God in Psalm 110, and as the suffering servant of Yahweh in Isaiah 53. This is how Jesus, the language, the ideas are already there in the Old Testament for Jesus to show their fulfillment in his person and in his mission. And of course, the high priest understood what he said. Sadly, some modern scholars don't understand what he said, but the high priest understood what he said, and that's why he tore his clothes and he said, you have heard the blasphemy. And Raymond Brown has a great discussion of what blasphemy is. Blasphemy is claiming the divine prerogatives that are reserved for God alone for yourself, and or equating yourself with God, which I would say Jesus is doing both here. Like I said, I don't know how much the high priest understood. He at least bare minimum understood that Jesus was claiming divine prerogatives for himself, and therefore he should die. He in no way entertained the possibility that Jesus was telling the truth. Right? He didn't take time to think about that option. As N.T. Wright says, Caiaphas' court has become part of the evil force which is oppressing the true Israel, and which will be overthrown when Yahweh vindicates his people. Caiaphas, the high priest, has become the new Antiochus Epiphanes, the great tyrant oppressing Yahweh's people. The Sanhedrin was playing the fourth beast to Jesus' Son of Man. The courtroom is turned inside out. The prisoner becomes the judge, the condemned criminal. Now I won't read it all, but basically this is Raymond Brown, again, one of the top scholars, but very liberal in a lot of ways, but yet he says, Jesus here in Mark 14:61, there might be coloring by the author, expansion, different things, but Jesus here did make this claim. He did claim to be the Son of Man. And I think that's something I'd want to say, is that whether it's in John where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, or he says in Mark 14, you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God and coming with the clouds of heaven. In both cases, he's making the same claim, just with different Old Testament language. And John is more emphasizing, as I said, I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more wanting to show you who Jesus was and get that rise out of you, like with Neusner. Who do you think you are, God? But John is just coming out like he does at the beginning of the book and just saying he's God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But in the synoptics, they're doing it more artistically, more going from earth up, and rather than from heaven down, as John is doing. And just I'll close with this great text. So you have the Son of Man sayings from earth, you have the Son of Man sayings of suffering, death, and resurrection, and then you have the Son of Man sayings of coming in glory. And so Revelation capitalizes on that. Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all the peoples of the earth will mourn because of him. So shall it be. Amen. That's what I had. So we can, let's go back to questions now, if there are any.
Great. You can stop sharing your screen if you want to, Justin.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so this is back to the interactive portion of the program. If anyone wants to ask Justin a question about what they've heard over the course of this webinar session, you can raise your hand, or you can submit questions via the Q&A box, and I will read them to Justin in due course. Let me just look at the question box real quick while waiting for people to raise hands and interact. So Brian Marcus asked, Ezekiel is often referred to the Son of Man. How is it different from the Son of Man when it is referred to Jesus? In Hebrew and Greek, is there two different words, one to refer to Jesus and another to human beings?
That's a great question. Yeah, so Ezekiel, unlike, so if people don't know, Daniel is fascinating because the book of Daniel, the author of Daniel wrote the first chapter up to chapter 2, verse 4 in Hebrew, and then he started writing in Aramaic all the way to the end of chapter 7, and then he wrote in Hebrew the rest of the book. And there's all kinds of ideas of why he did that. I think it's to distinguish between his discussion of Israel and the nations and the Gentiles. But Daniel 7 happens to fall in our Aramaic portion of the book of Daniel. So in Aramaic, you have, like I said, it's one like a bar anash. You don't have bar anashah in Daniel because it's, as I said, it's not even really a title there. In Daniel 7, it's not a title. In Daniel 7, it's Daniel seeing in the vision this human-like figure. And so he says, he looks like a human being. That's basically what he's saying. He's one like a son of man. But then that figure, that one like a son of man figure, becomes a title, at least by First Enoch, because in First Enoch, it's being referred to back as the Son of Man. And then in the New Testament, on the lips of Jesus, it's clearly the Son of Man. Now in Ezekiel, it's in Hebrew, and in Ezekiel, it's Ben Adam. So remember, Adam in Hebrew means man or mankind, right? And so when God says to Ezekiel, he says it about 30-something times in Ezekiel, Ben Adam. He's saying, oh, son of man. He's basically saying, you human being. So see, so the phrase son of man in a generic way just means a man, just means a human being. It only means this divine figure because of the descriptions that I gave, the attributes I talked about, flying on the clouds and being worshipped, this particular figure in Daniel 7. And so you also have the Son of Man mentioned in Psalm 8. What do you care for man that you do all this for him? The Son of Man. Remember, so it's parallel with man there. And that's all it means. It just means it just means mankind or human. And so in Ezekiel, yeah, there's no, for one, Ezekiel is before Daniel. And so it's not in any way referring to this divine figure in Daniel.
Great. Stokey Jed asked, recently heard someone say they read a Jewish scholar who said it's sons of man, plural, and refers to Israel. Hearsay, I know, but that aside, as I can't give a reference, but could be plural no matter who it refers to. Could it be plural no matter who it refers to? So he's asking, could the Son of Man be a plural reference? Yeah,
actually, yes. You don't have Son of Man in the plural in any of these texts we're talking about, but it is true that we do have places, even I think some in the Gospel, there's a few places in the Gospel where it'll refer to sons of men, and again, it's that generic statement. It's like sons of men meaning mankind, meaning people. So that's all that means. So what stands out? See, and it's harder to know it without seeing it in the original language, but the phrase that's used 81 times on the lips of Jesus in the four Gospels is unique. Even those other places where Son of Man occurs, whether it be in Daniel, whether it be in Acts or in Hebrews and Revelation, it never occurs the way it is written on the lips of Jesus. So the way it's written on the lips of Jesus is unique. It's very emphatic, the Son of Man, which even some have translated as to bring it out, to bring the fullness of the Greek out, that Son of Man. So I am that Son of Man, referring to the Son of Man from Daniel 7.
James asked, how do those who claim that Jesus used Son of Man to refer to a future entity handle statements about what the Son of Man has already done, such as the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing. So if you read through Bart Ehrman's book and where he goes through these sayings, basically, if the saying in any way sounds like Jesus is talking about himself, well, the early church made that up and put that on the lips of Jesus. I mean, that's what they have to do. So that's the problem. So that's why Raymond Brown even says this view is just not a good view, because you're just arbitrarily deciding, even though you have these sayings in every strata of sources from Jesus, in Q and M and L and Mark, in all of them, he's making these claims, and at least one of all those sayings, he's talking about himself clearly. If he starts talking about himself, then the early church must have made it up. If he's talking in the third person, where it sounds like he could be referring to somebody else distinct from himself, then the historical Jesus must have said that, and it's purely arbitrary when it comes to that decision. And I try, like, if you watch my debate with Bart Ehrman, I try to challenge him on exactly a lot of those sayings. And what happens a lot is he'll just say, well, I don't believe Jesus said that. And I'll say, well, on what basis? And I mean, there's no criteria other than it doesn't fit with his already preconceived decision that the historical Jesus didn't claim to be the Son of Man. So therefore, any saying that has the Jesus saying he's the Son of Man must be invented by the early church and put on his lips.
Find that a lot in the Muslim apologetics community as well. Well, we don't believe Jesus said that if it's inconvenient, but if it's something that comports with Islam, then oh yes, Jesus of course said that, without any real methodology as to how you select the authentic sayings. We have a question from Garrett, who says, it seems strange to me that we do not see any pre-Christian Jewish sources linking the Son of Man to some kind of an incarnation. The Son of Man seems so naturally to lend itself to the concept of an incarnation, and there were conceptions about the angel of the Lord and the Logos as an incarnation. Is there no discussion of the linkage pre-Christian? It seems like Jewish was innovative in this regards.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, like I said, I think you had the Son of Man figure contemporary with Christianity and before as this power, king, whatever you want to call him, in heaven, in glory. But the idea that he is a man, like a human, like coming to earth as a human, or suffering or dying, or any type of humiliation of the Son of Man is, as far as I can see, completely unique to what the New Testament is saying about the Son of Man figure. You don't have it. You don't have that anywhere else.
Great. Josh asked a question which I think you've already addressed, but he said, what do you say to people, perhaps New Testament scholars from North Carolina, who deny the originality of this saying?
Say that again? I missed.
What do you say to people, perhaps New Testament scholars from North Carolina, who deny the originality of this saying? I think you've already addressed that. But
yeah, they would deny the originality
of this.
The originality that. Okay, yeah, I would say, well, where the originality from Daniel or from Jesus?
I think he's talking about Jesus.
Yeah, because you're talking about Jesus. I mean, who else? What other human being ever claimed to be the Son of Man? even up to this present day. I mean, you do have people claiming to be the Messiah throughout history, but I don't know of anybody who ever claimed to be the Son of Man other than Jesus of Nazareth. Even purported to have claimed to be the Son of Man, right? Because, like I said, you have all those writings, these Jewish writings in Second Temple Judaism do exalt, and sometimes in a divine way, I would even say, figures like Abraham and Moses and things. But again, it's figures that lived, they're like, patriarchs, people who lived hundreds and hundreds, thousands, sometimes years before them. So with Jesus, that's what's unique about Jesus is here's a man that lived at their time that's making these claims, right? I mean that's what's different. That's as original as it can get. I mean, unless you can find me somebody who claimed to be the Son of Man, even someone who said they claimed to be the Son of Man, and then I would agree it wasn't original.
Okay, Brian has a question. Go ahead, Brian.
Hi, Justin.
How you doing?
It seems that in the Gospels, a lot of them refer to the Messiah as the son of David.
Yes.
And Jesus didn't deny that. So we have the issue of Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man, people calling him the Son of David. We have also referenced the Son of God. And then we also understand that he's the seed of Abraham, he's the seed of David. So in coming up with the Christology of who Jesus is, shouldn't one take all of that into account? That's the one thing. And the second thing is, isn't the Son of Man a reference that he's not just the Messiah for the Jews? He's the Messiah or the Savior for all of mankind.
Yeah, great points. And I completely agree. I would want to take all those statements. And so for example, the Son of David idea, you have that as early as Paul's letters. You have that at the beginning of Romans. He is, as to his human nature, he is of the seed of David. As to the spirit of holiness, he is the Son of God. So I think these are different Jewish ways of referring to, as far as the early Christians, of how they're just telling us who Jesus is. And that's why I think we have to come to the conclusion that he was fully human. He was a descendant of David, a descendant of Abraham. But he was also this Son of Man figure, which if he was, then he was this divine heavenly figure, which I would say in seed could be one with the God of Israel in Daniel 7. And that's exactly what the early Christians start to say. As I said, it's ambiguous just with the texts of Daniel and with Second Temple Judaism text, but New Testament are making it clear that Jesus falls on that divine side, even though they make it crystal clear that he's also a human. He's the Son of David. He's the Messiah. Interestingly, the Son of God statement titles, especially at the time of Jesus, that would have meant more, for Jesus' contemporaries, that would have meant more that he was a human, kingly Davidic figure. That wouldn't have been more of a divine title, as it became more of a divine title later. Son of Man, like I said, doesn't really mean that he's human. It more means that he's this divine figure that was floating around in Judaism from Daniel 7 and 1 Enoch. So interestingly, throughout church history, most of the time, Son of God means he's God, and Son of Man means he's human, but it's the opposite in the first century. In the context of Jesus' own ministry, if someone talked about the Son of Man, they would have thought divine. If someone talked about the Son of God, they would have thought the Son of David, the one who's to come, the Psalm 2, the one who would come and fulfill Psalm 2. You are my son, today I become your father. That just means he's the King of Israel. So, and the second part I forgot already, but I was going to comment on that. What was the second point you made?
The second point that the Son of God, vis-a-vis the Son of Man, no, rather the Son of David, pointing to Jesus being the Messiah for the Jews.
Yeah.
Savior of the Jews. And the Son of Man, as in Luke chapter 3, implying that Jesus is actually the Savior of humankind.
Yes,
of all of
definitely.
Humankind.
No, I completely agree. And I think that's already there in the promises, the covenants of Abraham. Remember, through his seed, all nations, not just Israel, all nations will be blessed. And when you go to the book of Isaiah, probably that's why Paul and the early Christians quote Isaiah more than just about any other book other than the Psalms. And it's because Isaiah is dealing with the Gentiles and the other nations and how God is going to reach out his arm. He's going to pull out his arm. He's going to reach out his forearm and save all mankind. All nations are going to be saved, not just Israel. And so that is one of the things that a lot of the Jewish leadership at the time of Jesus had a problem with, is that Jesus, he was the Messiah. He was claiming to be the Messiah, but he wasn't just their Messiah. He was the Messiah for the whole world. So, very good.
Just to add to that, Isaiah 49 says, "Is it too small a thing for you to restore the tribes of Jacob? I will also make you a light to the Gentiles."
That's right.
And we see that Jesus doesn't set up his head office in Jerusalem, but in Capernaum, which is Galilee of the Gentiles. So this concept of the Son of Man being one for all of mankind is something that really stands out strongly for me in the New Testament.
And I would even, just to add, I've shared the screen to go off your point. You go back to the Daniel 7 passage, notice, what's it say about the Son of Man? All the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. So, yeah, the Son of Man, even in the Jewish text, I mean, it's a Jewish origin, Jewish text, Jewish, man, Daniel, all that. But the promises reach far beyond Israel. They reach to the ends of the earth.
Right. And that's also an additional reason not to take it as referring to the nation of Israel.
Yeah, I'm just reading things here. Okay.
Because how can all nations serve a nation?
That's right.
Individual. Yeah. And as Brian mentioned, Isaiah 49. As well, there's a connection there.
Great points, Brian.
All right, thank you, Brian. By the way, regarding the title "Son of God," the Son of God is actually used on occasion in the Gospels as a title of deity. For example, in Matthew 11, which is paralleled also in Luke 10, we read, at that time Jesus declared, verse 25, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you've hidden these things from the wise and understanding, revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will." And in verse 27, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." And so he's claiming there to have perfect and exhaustive knowledge of the Father, and indeed be in a unique relationship with the Father, and unique in the way that he has exhaustive and complete knowledge of the Father, and the Father has exhaustive knowledge of the Son. I don't know how he can possibly claim that if the Son of God is not a divine title, at least in that context.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. I think there's tons of places, like in Paul, where Son of God for them definitely means deity. What I'm saying is that it had to be clarified. It would have to be clarified for the audience of Jesus's contemporaries, because many of them thought of the Son of God as whether it's Caesar as a Son of God, like a divine being in the Greco-Roman, but the Jews, it would be like just a king, a Davidic ruler. Mm-hmm. But when he goes beyond that to say, but the Son who knows the Father, who knows everything about the Father, who the Father chooses who he knows, that's making it clear that we're talking about getting more close to Nicene Christology type Son, right? I mean, that's more of a Son in the sense of oneness with God, mm-hmm. in essence, not in the nature, not more functional as just the Davidic king would be called the Son of God.
Right. Even David is referred to as the Son of God, like in 2 Samuel 7 or in Psalm 2 and so on. In Psalm 82, I've said you're God, you're all sons of the Most High. So there's different senses in which the term is used. Let me bring up James again. He's got his hand raised. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Do you have comments, James?
I typed it in.
Oh, okay. You had your hand raised as well.
There were a couple.
Okay, let me read what you typed in. Do you want me to read what you typed in, or do you want to express it here?
You can go ahead.
Oh, okay.
It's not up on my screen. I was listening to what I just followed. Okay. I think one of my questions. Okay, I'll take it. One of my questions was, in Luke 11:49, when Jesus is talking about God, is he talking about himself, or is that just a weird syntax glitch where it means more something like God and his wisdom? Jeremiah, I had mentioned, it said that the Son of Man is almost the only title that is used, but what about those references to wisdom? And if those references to wisdom are references to Jesus, then can you provide any handles to, well, that's why I wrote it down.
Okay, the way that you typed it in is, how do you understand Jesus' references to the wisdom of God? Is Jesus referring to himself? And if so, does this imply that he understood himself to be non-created or created?
Yeah, let me get, I got Luke 11:49. Let me show you Matthew's parallel, which is interesting. This is where we get to synoptic criticism. If you look at, I think it's in Matthew 23, maybe it's the parallel. Yeah, in Matthew, if you look right here, I'll get it on the screen so y'all can see it. If you look at there you go. There it is. So you look at, so this would be a Q saying. And so in Luke, it has, for this reason, also the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill, and some they will persecute. Matthew has, therefore, I am sending you prophets and wise men. So Matthew has Jesus speaking as the wisdom of God. Luke has Jesus quoting the wisdom of God. So wisdom is interesting because I do think, I wouldn't say, I think the reason why John doesn't say Sophia or wisdom was made flesh is because Sophia is in the feminine. And that's why I think he chose Logos. But I do think the idea of wisdom in the Old Testament is there as much. And if you think of wisdom as an attribute of God, I think Jesus is, as Paul calls him, he is the wisdom of God. And so he is, in a sense, the wisdom of God in the flesh. But I can't think of any besides this. And even here, so you have some discrepancy of like, what did Jesus actually say as far as wisdom? I can't think of any places where Jesus actually says, I'm wisdom. He doesn't say anything like that. And so I don't think the historical Jesus probably said that, but just like he didn't go around saying, I'm Lord. He didn't use a lot of language that will be referred to him later, but that will be that the disciples will more fully understand who he is. So we're dealing with, what did Jesus actually reveal about himself and say about himself while he was walking the earth? And wisdom, I don't think, is one that he, like in most of these texts, like when they go into Jesus's claims, you don't really have much about wisdom as far as Jesus specifically, his claims about himself. But of course, Paul and the rest of the writers are clearly showing that Jesus is the wisdom of God.
It shows actually just in a tremendous constraint, I think, on the part of the early church, that Jesus actually doesn't identify himself by many of the titles that you find in the later writings.
Exactly. Lord, Christ, wisdom, God. You don't have Jesus going around Galilee calling himself those titles. The only title you see him consistently using is Son of Man. And that just happens to be the title that the early church doesn't use. That's what's crazy.
And then even on some of the very hot potato topics in the early church, like circumcision, the role of women, charismatic gifts, and so forth, Jesus never addresses those. So you see this tremendous amount of constraint on the part of the early church. which is remarkable. The fact that much of Jesus reveals his self-identity cryptically with these cryptic allusions to the Old Testament, and it's phenomenal.
Yeah, completely agree.
So, James, your second question that you had submitted was Luke 11:49. Okay, is this one you already asked? You asked about Luke 11:49, whether Jesus is referring to himself. Okay, we covered the wisdom of God. So the other one.
My bet, if I had to make a bet here, I mean, I would say if you had a recorder, Jesus said what Luke said here. I think Matthew is more theologizing it, giving us kind of the voice of Jesus. Matthew believed Jesus is the wisdom of God, so he doesn't have Jesus say the wisdom of God said. He just has Jesus speaking it. But if we were there and we were listening to Jesus, Jesus probably would have said the wisdom of God said. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. You also asked
with that idea. Did the typical early Christian see wisdom as created or uncreated?
Yeah, I mean that. I can't imagine. I don't see anybody saying, all that goes back to that passage in Proverbs 8 where it's using poetic language. I mean, to say wisdom was created, but I mean, I think it's just, that's the thing. I think it's just poetic language, and to imagine God's wisdom coming into existence is kind of absurd, because, what are we saying then? God wasn't wise for all time? God, there was a time when God was not wise.
You have God becoming wise.
Wisdom was created. So I think I think all those debates in the early church about Proverbs 8 was just completely missing the context of Proverbs 8, that it's just poetry. And so, before the worlds, were born, I came forth, I mean, it's not making a strong theological point that wisdom was created at one point. That Arius was right, that there was a time when wisdom was not. It's like, no.
It's a favorite argument of the Jehovah's Witnesses today. They like to look at Proverbs 8 and argue that means Christ was created, even though it's not necessarily.
Yeah, it's absurd.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just so you know, even the Hebrew, so the Greek word in Proverbs 8 is the Greek word that means created in the Septuagint, but the Hebrew word is more ambiguous. The Hebrew word can mean create, but it can also mean possessed. He possessed me at the beginning. So it's not even a clear cut.
That's part of the reason why. That might be part of the reason why I think Origen struggled with that, because he was in the mix with the Septuagint there. But do you have any handles that you could go to how would you, if somebody would ask, how can I put together these concepts of the word and the wisdom? Have any suggestions on how to show them that these two things blend together, that they dovetail, so to speak?
I mean, I would show passages from John. John is the only one who really exploits Logos and how Jesus is the Logos, working off of the Old Testament idea of Devar, of the Word of God, being active and agent of God, but also the Greek idea of Logos being kind of the what brings harmony to the universe and rationality and logic. And then I'd go to Paul and look how Paul uses Sophia, and how he, like in 1 Corinthians 1:30, how he calls how he refers to Jesus as, he has become to us wisdom from God, righteousness, sanctification, redemption. So there's a lot of places, probably other parallels. He calls him Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So Paul really is the one who really brings out the idea of Jesus as the wisdom of God more specifically. So I would just more emphasize those passages. But see that, so like Jesus is our righteousness, Jesus is our sanctification. That's why it's more of an attribute. I see Jesus as the wisdom of God as more of an attribute. That since he's fully God, he has all the attributes of God, which includes wisdom and righteousness and other things. And as the Word of God, it's a little bit more appropriate word to refer to who Jesus is, outside of the man. As far as pre-incarnate Jesus, how do how do we refer to Jesus before he was the man from Nazareth? John chose halagos. He was the Word. And that's because of all the background with that word in the Old Testament. And so, yeah, logos fits much more to refer to Jesus in that sense as the incarnation of the Word rather than the incarnation of wisdom or sanctification or righteousness. Hope that helps.
Can you use any of the Isaiah servant psalms that's kind of a link between those things, where the Spirit of God is upon servant with the Spirit of wisdom?
Say that again. What about that?
As a link between these three concepts of the Son of Man, the wisdom of God, and the Logos, would it be valid to use any of Isaiah's imagery from the servant psalms to pull those three concepts together?
Yeah, definitely. And you're maybe referring to Isaiah 11. That's more messianic brain, spirit of wisdom.
Yeah, that's probably number one right there.
Thank you, James. Let me go to Jehu, who's also got his hand to raise. Jehu, are you there? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're very quiet, but go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, not very clearly. You're very quiet, but trying to...
Maybe talk a little bit louder, but we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you good now.
Yeah, my question is I have one question. Justin said that Jesus used the title Son of Man 81 times himself referring. But he also acknowledged that first century Christians, or Paul the Apostle and his disciples, do not use the title many often. So logically, I think we should expect, if this is the most important title for Jesus, referring himself as the Son of Man, and he's giving his identity through this title, so can't we expect from his disciples using this title, sharing the gospel to Jews in the first century, referring back to Daniel, that Jesus is the Son of Man, who is already portrayed in the book of Daniel, or even Paul the Apostle using the title, or first century Christians writers using this title often, more than Jesus using himself. So my question is, we should expect Christian writers using this title more often. So why don't we see this if it is the most important title for Jesus?
So it's a great point, and I think exactly what you said there at the end is a clue to the idea. I think this is a little bit shrouded in mystery. I'm shocked that the early church has Jesus call himself the Son of Man in the Gospels 81 times, and yet they call Jesus the Son of Man only a few times. And even in the early church, even if you go into the early church fathers and you move through, this is not a title that they're using much there either. And in fact, when they do use it, they always use it wrong. You see the early church from the very beginning, outside the New Testament, they don't understand what the Son of Man means, and it's because most of them are Gentile. And so when they say that, when they talk about Jesus as the Son of Man or quote him as the Son of Man, they talk about his humanity, that this means that he's fully human. They used it in the more hypostatic union type idea. Son of God, he's fully God. Son of Man means he's human. See, they completely miss all the Danielic imagery. And so my guess on this, well, one, I want to make the point that Paul, scholars in some of those books I was showing you, Paul does refer to the Son of Man figure. The reason why you don't see the phrase "the Son of Man" in Paul is because, again, this is a unique way the gospel writers were translating Jesus's Aramaic title, Bar Anashah, into Greek. So because they did it doesn't mean everybody's going to translate Jesus's phrase the same way. And most agree that what Paul is doing, for example, I'll show you. I think it's like 1 Corinthians 15. When Paul compares Jesus with Adam in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual man is not the first, but the natural, then the spiritual. And then notice he says, the first man is from the earth, earthy. The second man, look at that, is from heaven. Now, what's in Paul's mind when he says the second man is from heaven? You know, this is close to incarnation language for Paul. And if you look at First Thessalonians 4, what's the imagery Paul uses for the second coming of Jesus? Notice he will, the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout. And did I miss it? No, it's I think over here. Where does it say? Yeah, caught it. There it is. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So Paul uses this language of Jesus coming with the clouds and with angels throughout his letters, and the fact that he calls Jesus the man. So in Greek for Paul, the way he seems to be using the same idea that Jesus was the Son of Man from Daniel is he calls him the man or the second man from heaven. And so Paul seems to be alluding to that same idea from Daniel 7. That part didn't he didn't miss that at all. So he's using the same thing. He's just not using the language that the gospel writers use after Paul, because remember the gospels were written after Paul. And so they come in and they decide that the best phrase to translate Jesus's self-referential title is the Son of Man. And also keep in mind, Paul is not quoting Jesus, not telling stories of Jesus. Remember, Paul's more teaching theology. So if Paul told a story of Jesus, maybe he would have used the Son of Man if he was telling a story of Jesus and quoting Jesus himself. But Paul isn't doing that. So those are some things to think about. But I think one of the things is because the Son of Man is such a Jewish Daniel, First Enoch, in its original context idea, my best guess is that the early church largely didn't use that because Kyrios, Lord, with the opposition to Caesar of the Roman Empire, the message that they were sending out to the as they were proclaiming the gospel to the ends of the earth, they found Christ, they found Lord, they found Son of God, they found these to be much more readily understandable titles for Jesus than the Son of Man. But that's really just more of a guess. I'm surprised that we don't see the title used more, especially like even in the later letters and later books of the New Testament.
Okay, thank you, Justin.
Great question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
James is wanting us to note that 1 Corinthians 15:47 is a textual variant. Are you aware of that, Justin?
Not the second man is from heaven, is it?
I'm not aware. I'm not sure. I don't know. Perhaps.
There's a variant in 49. Yeah, I can check it right now. I have Metzger. Oh, you're right. Okay, but yeah, there is a variant there, but it looks like somebody put, instead of man here, they put Lord. But notice Metzger gives anthropos, which means man, an A rating, which means he's almost 100% certain that that's their correct reading. But interesting, I didn't know about this variant.
Yeah. James is saying, look at P46, earliest manuscript.
Yeah, he says, yeah, the singular reading. Yeah, P46 has it, but I'm gonna go with Metzger. But I think even if say that wasn't there, you still have Paul using the imagery of the clouds throughout. And so Paul's aware of the Daniel 7 passage and saying that Jesus is fulfilling that Daniel 7 imagery. He's going to do that when he returns from Paul's point of view. But again, I think the reasons I laid out before is the reason why you never see the Son of Man in Paul is the same reason why you don't see the Son of Man in the other letters, is because Paul's not narrating the stories of Jesus. Anyone who's narrating the stories of Jesus, we find when they're quoting Jesus, they are saying the Son of Man.
Right. Sharon is asking, hi, as far as we are aware, is there an exception in the Greek manuscripts to Jesus using the definite article when referring to himself?
We don't have one. Yeah, in all the places where Jesus refers to himself, it's the Son of Man. Ha huios, ha anthropos is the Greek, but it's the Son of Man in all the places. No exceptions.
Brian Marion draws our attention to Matthew 16:16, where we read, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Clearly here, Son of Man in context is a divine title.
Say Matthew 16, but what's the question about Matthew 16?
He says clearly here, Son of God in context is a divine title. So as we were saying earlier, Son of God can sometimes be used as a divine title, but is not always used that way.
Definitely. Yeah, as I was saying, this is where I talk a lot about the system of verba, the very words of Jesus, and the voice of Jesus. So bringing out more fully what the voice of Jesus would be the gospel writers bringing out more fully what Jesus meant by what he actually said. And so here's, I think, a good example in Matthew 16, because if you look at the parallels in Mark, which Matthew was using, in Mark, he just says, "You are the Christ." And so if we were there, I think the verba of Jesus is the verba there is "you are the Christ," but Matthew's bringing out Jesus by being the Christ is also the Son of the living God, which is a divine title.
Right. Well, there's no hands currently raised, and there's nothing in the Q&A box. Anyone else have any further questions or comments on anything that we've been discussing this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world? If you have any comments or questions, you can raise your hand and we will promote you to be co-panelists, or you can submit the Q&A box and we'll read out your question. I was hoping that yes, no might have something to say, but we haven't had any dissenting comments so far today.
Yeah, I've been too nice. Where's people trying to trip me up?
We do actually have a hand raised. We have a hand raised from James again. Let me bring him up. Greetings.
Yes. Well, since we have time, how do you understand Ezekiel's use of the term "son of man"?
Yeah, I said earlier, I think, so in Ezekiel, it's the Hebrew ben Adam, and I think it's clearly just a statement of humanity. So without, I mean, even in Daniel, if you didn't have all the statements of flying on the clouds, being worshipped, being king over the kingdom, I would just see it as, it just means a man. It just means a human being. It's only because of those extra attributes and titles that make it more than just a human being. So in Ezekiel, I think it's just God saying, "Hey, you man, you human being," is all he's saying when he says, "Oh, son of man."
Okay. I just want to wrap up that loose end there.
Yeah, great. Thanks for all your great questions, man.
Any further questions, or are we going to wrap up? Give people another few minutes to raise their hand if anyone has any last questions that they want to raise. How are you doing for time, Justin?
I'm good. If we're out of questions, I get it. Everybody understands perfectly what I said, so there's no need for questions.
James is asking in the chat, will this be uploaded to YouTube? Yes, this will be uploaded to YouTube. If folks want to go to if you want the link for the YouTube channel where we upload these sessions, I will get it for you right now. These sessions are proving to be quite popular on YouTube.
It's great.
The Matt Dillahunty one has gone wild. Got 12,530 views on my channel and about 40,000 views on Matt's channel for it. So
It's great.
And folks, here is the link for the YouTube channel where you can see some of the past sessions. We record them every week, provided the speaker gives us permission to record, which is normally. And yeah, we've got a lot of viewers there. We have 405 subscribers on the YouTube channel so far. So be sure to subscribe, and you'll be kept up to date with past sessions if you miss any. And if you want to be kept up to date on our upcoming sessions, we have the URL where you can find out about upcoming sessions is this link here, apologetics-academy.org/online-training. And we also have a service for Christians who are struggling and wrestling with intellectual doubts about the Christian faith, which you can find at the following link, where you can submit a form, and I will set up a small private meeting to discuss your areas of doubt. There's the link there. Sharon asked a question in the Q&A box. She asked, can you recommend a good commentary on the deity of Christ, not Daniel specifically, but a good general one that follows a trajectory from Genesis to Revelation?
That's a good question. You say a good book or a good comment? Say it again.
She was asking for a good commentary.
A good commentary. You would really just need to get a good commentary on a particular book that has key passages that deal with the deity of Christ. So solid commentaries like on Philippians for the hymn in Philippians 2, or commentaries on like the Gospel of Mark for the passage in Mark 14 that we discussed, or the Gospel of John. Of course, Raymond Brown's commentary on the Gospel of John is great. On the Gospel of Mark, you have a ton of good ones. Let's see. Really good ones on Mark. Probably my favorite on Mark would probably Craig Evans. Craig Evans has a commentary on Mark. It's really good. And I think Gundry's Mark's Apology for the Cross, I think is that's gonna, if you go to those particular passages in those commentaries, it'll have great discussions on his claims. As far as books that deal with Jesus's claims to deity, like Michael Bird's How God Became Jesus. This has a lot of excellent chapters in it.
Bird, by the way, will be speaking to our group in November, I think it is. It's November.
Oh, great.
Yeah, he's scheduled, but it might be December.
Yeah, that one, and then the Who is Jesus by Bach, by Darrell Bach. I think that's going to have a lot of the key arguments for. Bach pretty much wrote the definitive work on blasphemy and on trial scene in Mark 14, so he brings in a lot of that into that book. So those would be the top ones I'd recommend. Really good books to check out just on Jesus, though. Books like N.T. Wright's, some of his books on Jesus, like Simply Jesus or Who is Jesus, and then even Tim Keller's book on Mark, on it's called The King's Cross, or Jesus the Son of God. those are just really good discussions of Jesus, especially for bringing the scholarship down to size, and very devotional kind of books too. So some of the best off the top of my head.
Garrett has had his hand raised. Garrett, are you there?
My man, Garrett.
What's up, guys?
We're doing pretty good. How are you?
Hey. Good, how are you?
I'm doing well. Where are you calling from?
Dallas, Texas, right here with Justin.
Oh, awesome.
Justin, did it just start pouring rain at your house too?
Yes, yeah, it's pouring outside.
Cool.
It knocked my computer out, thankfully.
Hey, well, I don't really have anything to say. I just raised my hand because I just figured, like everybody's done asking things. I'm going to just raise my hand and say something random. So I thought, we might as well have Justin talk a little bit about, Justin, I have to say, I loved this seminar. I thought it was amazing. And I also really liked your debate with Bart. And, you've persuaded me. And for those of you who don't know me, and I've talked a little bit with Jonathan and Justin, and I am not a believer myself, but I have been convinced by you, Justin. I think that it is more likely because of all the reasons you said that your case is accurate as opposed to some of the things that Bart has said. I think, you asked for a challenge, so I thought the only thing that I could really think of to throw at you was
no, leave it at the compliment, Garrett. Just compliment me and move on.
The only thing I could think of to challenge you with was that in John, Jesus's words sound a little bit different than they do in the Gospels, and so I know that you might have some things to say about that. And I actually agree with you probably on what you're going to say. That what we have in John is the voice of Jesus. But I'm interested to see, how would you argue for what Jesus says in John being the words of Jesus as opposed to just the voice? Because I could definitely get the voice, but the words, it does seem a little bit, So yeah, there you go. That's
good. No, yeah, I'll say a few things on that. That's a great point. One example that I think is helpful to think about would be the feeding of the 5,000, which is fascinating because it's in all four Gospels. It's one of the only miracle. I think it's the only miracle that's in all four Gospels. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when you have the feeding of the 5,000, he breaks the bread and the fish and he feeds everyone. There's no teaching. There's no comment. There's nothing said from Jesus as far as some sort of discourse about that. And in John, you get about 50 verses of discourse. I am the bread of life, and all those things that Jesus says after the miracle. Now, just thinking common sense wise, Jesus, if he did that miracle, I'm sure he had something to say about it afterwards, right? I mean, it just makes sense to me that if Jesus were to do a miracle like that with all of them out there and they're listening to his teaching, I mean, he probably said a lot of things about that. Now, John then is, I think, giving us, more on the voice side of Jesus, because I think it's cloaked in more Johannine language as throughout the gospel. But I think we're getting an idea of the kinds of things Jesus probably said. Now, how much of that he said that's, if we had a voice recorder, would he have said exactly the same every word? Well, definitely not. For one, John is writing in Greek. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. So you already have all these, translation issues. But I do think Jesus must have been saying something that had, Eucharistic type language, like, something about how he's comparing himself to the bread, how his blood is being compared to the wine, something about, he must have been saying some shocking things, eat my flesh, drink my blood. What exactly did he say? I think we're given the truth in John. I think we're given what, Jesus in heaven would not disagree with anything John said, but I do think we're given more the voice of John. But I think that's an example where we have in the synoptics, we don't have we just have the story and we have the miracle. But in John, we're given this kind of exposition about it. And I think John is okay with expanding on the words of Jesus because he believes he's led by the Paraclete. He's led by the Holy Spirit in saying these things.
That's a beautiful answer. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
I mean, so you're basically just saying, like, it's another source. I mean, why wouldn't it have been accurate? I mean, maybe,
Yeah, and I think there's no doubt. I think especially so one of the evidences that we have more of the voice is because, like even in John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only son. The question is whether is Jesus saying that as he's speaking to Nicodemus, or has now the author John shifted and now he's writing this as kind of an exposition of what Jesus has said to Nicodemus. John's language and Jesus's language is very similar, and so that's where you get the idea that you have more of the voice of Jesus because John's language is very similar. But did Jesus have this discussion with Nicodemus? Did he challenge him to be born again in some sense? Did he have this kind of debate? I think for sure. I mean, I think one way to prove it, like you said, the way I would want to go about proving it, if we could change the scholarship trajectory, would be to show that John is an eyewitness. Richard Bauckham goes the way of saying that the author of John is not John the disciple, the son of Zebedee, but is another eyewitness that was there, that was a disciple of Jesus, but wasn't one of the 12. I mean, that's one way to go, and he's gotten a little bit of traction with that. But I mean, I think the early church testimony that's unanimous that it's John, the son of Zebedee. I mean, I think I can trust that, and I think there's good reasons to trust that.
By the way, regarding the authorship of John's Gospel, it's interesting that the authorship of John's Gospel is attested by Irenaeus in particular, and Irenaeus, of course, was self-confessedly a disciple of Polycarp of Smyrna. And according to what Irenaeus tells us, Polycarp of Smyrna was a direct disciple of John the Apostle himself. And so you have this unbroken chain of custody, if you will. Yeah. And also, it's interesting that Irenaeus tells us specifically that John's Gospel was composed while John was resident at Ephesus. Ephesus is very close to Smyrna, geographically in Asia Minor, which is where Polycarp is from. So Irenaeus, of all people, is in a likely position to have known that John the Apostle was the author of that Gospel. Secondly, and moreover, you have Polycarp quoting from the epistles of John, and in his only surviving epistle, his epistle to the church at Philippi, he quotes from the epistles of John, which is interesting because you would think that if the Johannine epistles were forgeries, Polycarp of all people should have known about it.
Yeah.
And then there's strong literary and thematic parallels between John's epistles and John's Gospel, suggesting strongly a commonality of authorship. And so the external evidence actually confirms the internal evidence of John's Gospel, because you would think that a forger writing John's Gospel and trying to pass it off as John the Apostle would have been far more emphatic and explicit about self-identifying as the author, rather than just self-identifying cryptically as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so the internal and external evidence coming together seems to suggest that John the Apostle is the most likely candidate for authorship of that Gospel.
Yeah, excellent points. And that's what I say. I think the early church testimony is compelling. And I think the claims at the end of the Gospel is very clear that, this was written by an eyewitness. So they're either lying or they're telling the truth. And I mean, I see no reason why to think that they're lying. I mean, I think, I think John 21, we do see some evidence that there's maybe the community of John after John died is kind of putting things together, but they're saying that this came from John himself. This came from the eyewitness. I mean, he saw these things. He was there. And it does, especially the story of Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene. I mean, my goodness, talk about a story that's without any type of, miraculous elaboration. I mean, you have the risen Jesus, but he's just talking to her like two people. I mean, there's no earthquakes or angels falling from the sky or crazy stuff. It's just a very simple story that just reads like an eyewitness account from Mary Magdalene. I don't know. I see no reason why not to trust it. But sadly, we can't use it because, it's just as much in debate settings because many scholars just don't accept it as trustworthy.
Is that all from you, Garrett, or do you have any other comments or questions?
No, I thought that was a great answer.
Great. Okay. We have 2 hands raised currently. Let me go to
Good to see you, Garrett.
Okay. Let me go to Brian Marion from South Africa again. Brian, welcome back. Are you there?
Just something that you mentioned that keeps coming up with my debates with Muslims here in South Africa, and also with my discussions. Whenever I start quoting any of the Gospels, they said, "But Jesus spoke Aramaic," and I just want to run my response by you to just get your views on it. In South Africa, we are a multi-language culture and community, and I grew up in Lenasia, which was a more Indian dominated suburb, and one of my very good friends was a Muslim. His name was Iqbal, and amongst us as friends, the lingua franca, what we spoke was English to each other. But at home, his heart language with his parents was Gujarati. And when he went to madrasa, he spoke Arabic. They taught him Arabic. And because we were under apartheid, we had to learn the language of the rulers, which was Afrikaans. And this guy, Iqbal, wasn't a very clever guy. In fact, he failed quite a few times. But he could distinctly speak 4 languages. Now, when I think of Jesus in his setting in first century Palestine, the rulers of Palestine at that time were the Romans. Mm-hmm. So Latin would have been spoken somehow. The language of instruction in the synagogue would have been Hebrew. So Jesus would have known Hebrew as well. The lingua franca would have been Greek because of, Greek just took over as the language of the civilized world. And then the heart language would have been Aramaic. That's what they were speaking. So to make a case that Jesus didn't speak Greek is unwarranted, because he very likely could have spoken all 4 languages. Your comments on that?
Yeah, well, I agree. I think I'd referenced that a little bit before, that I do think Jesus spoke some Greek. I think most Jews, there's been some new books. There's a book by a Sevenster that's called Do You Speak Greek or something like that. Did they speak Greek? I can't remember the exact title, but there's some scholarship that's arguing for much more, just like you're saying, a mixed setting of languages and cultures in first century Palestine. And I think that's definitely true. I do think we have very strong evidence in the Gospels that I think are accurate, and there's one more signs that it's accurately giving us what happened at the time of Jesus, because we do see these Aramaic phrases coming out, like Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and Abba. I think those reflect the fact that Jesus, with his disciples and the kind of the more orthodox, passionate Jews of the time, their primary language was Aramaic. I think Aramaic was the primary language that they did speak. Instruction in the synagogue probably was some Aramaic, some reading of Hebrew, things like that. But then I think outside of that, any type of interaction they had, especially like if Jesus was a carpenter, interaction with jobs, with work, any of the fishermen, you probably had to know enough Greek to get around, and you probably had to know maybe some Latin too, with maybe Roman soldiers and Roman authorities. So there would have been definitely some mixing, but even so, I don't see what the issue is. I mean, if they want to challenge the fact that it's not true to what Jesus said, they would have to show that the Greek in the New Testament isn't accurate to what Jesus said in Aramaic, and I don't see where their arguments for that would be.
It's just fascinating that the Aramaic statements that Jesus makes is when he is mainly in deep emotional distress.
Yes.
And if I am in pain, I will not speak English. I'll speak my home language. I will say Haya Hama or something like that. So when you are in anguish and you are in pain, you will go to your heart language. Is what I find in the gospel. So his heart language could have been Aramaic, the language of home, but it's definitely not the language of commerce. It's definitely not the language of trade.
Yeah, I agree.
Definitely not the lingua franca.
But when Jesus went around, when he taught, though, I do think he was speaking. When he is teaching, like when he's giving the Sermon on the Mount, when he's teaching, I do think I think we have good reason to think that Aramaic was the predominant way. Now, when he's speaking with Nicodemus, when he's speaking with the Roman soldiers, when he's speaking with Pilate, it's very possible he was speaking other languages.
Do you think that the Pharisees at the time were reading the scriptures in Aramaic? Clearly, they were reading the scriptures in Hebrew, or at the very least in Greek. But I don't know of any of the Hebrew scriptures in Aramaic.
Well, what you have with Aramaic scriptures is the Targums, which are Aramaic paraphrases. But the problem with the Targums is we don't know how early they go back. They date to like the 2nd century. They're similar to the rabbinic writings. So we do have the Jews getting the scriptures, at least in a paraphrase way, into the Aramaic. Now, I agree. I think the reading of the scripture would have been in Hebrew in the synagogues, and if anybody could read, as people probably may be familiar with Ehrman, he's quoted, the stats about reading and writing in the 1st century, based not based on his studies, but based on Catherine Hetzer, but it's very low. But people who could read and people who could write, Jews especially, we do know a little bit about them. So someone like Paul, someone like Jesus, even in Luke 4, when he's in the synagogue and he quotes from Isaiah. Josephus, we know a little bit about Josephus because he's in the same boat. So he spoke Aramaic in Galilee. He knew Hebrew, and then he learned Greek to do what he did as a Roman, informant, and he was kind of a historian for the Romans and doing his own thing.
So clearly, we would say when Jesus read from Isaiah 61 in Luke chapter 4, he was reading Hebrew.
Yes, and even if yeah, exactly.
And given that Paul was a contemporary with Jesus and the disciples, and we see what a magnificent Greek writer he was, Greek must have been very prolific in that area.
Oh, it was the lingua franca, no doubt. It definitely was.
Yeah.
But it was similar to, you can think of how some like even in like New York City, even in there's certain places like even in America where even a lot of places in the South where you have a large Hispanic community, and even though English is the dominant language, a lot of times many in the community don't speak English. There's places like that in Texas. There's probably places like that in California, other places, and there's probably other parallels to other languages. I think we have the same kind of thing going on with the Jews in the 1st century. I think most of them probably repelled maybe even a lot of the other languages because of the pagan nature of it. And I think Jesus comes from that kind of very hardcore Orthodox Judaism of that time. They were the least Hellenized kind of people. Jews from Jerusalem, from Galilee, from that whole area. That's the least Hellenized type Jew that you had. Now, but even so, I do think they learned it. I do think Peter and James, when they did their fishing trade and things, they definitely got some Greek down. They definitely got some maybe some Latin, and they knew Hebrew from the synagogue. So they were all multilingual in that sense. But I think Aramaic was the primary language that they spoke in when Jesus taught, and when they probably spoke privately. But that is interesting that you said that Jesus's Aramaic statements are all in high emotion. That is true. He says a few of them when he does miracles, but he seems to be still even saying them with great emotion, like, epatha, to be opened. So
It's interesting also, Brian and Justin, that when in John chapter 3, when Jesus is dialoguing with Nicodemus, the phrase born from above is very similar to born again. And it seems that that Nicodemus actually misunderstands Jesus' meaning, that Jesus is saying that you must be born from above. And Nicodemus says, how can you be born again when you are old? And that pun works in Greek, but doesn't work in Aramaic, which suggests that dialogue took place in Greek, in fact.
Exactly. That's an example where I think Greek may have been spoken. I mean, even, and look at his name, Nicodemus. I mean, both those words are Greek words. Nico is from Nikao, which means to conquer, and demos is for the people, democracy. So he's the conqueror of the people, you know. Nicodemus, I mean, so he probably was a guy, maybe he was a very Hellenized Jew, even though he was the leader, and he spoke in Greek primarily. And especially since maybe he had interaction with the Roman soldiers and the Roman leaders. And so, yeah, I do think Jesus probably had that discussion in Greek. He probably, I mean, when he talked to Pilate, I doubt Pilate. I mean, Pilate might have known Aramaic, but I think it's more likely Jesus spoke with him in Latin or Greek.
I mean, the Romans were rulers, but they also spoke mainly Greek, even though they had their own language, which was Latin.
Latin was more, like, especially first century, Latin was more just for the elite. It was more for the highly educated leaders. So Latin doesn't become really dominant in the Roman Empire until you get to about more Constantine type, where Greek is in the east and the Latin is in the west. But Latin is more Cicero type people, not even your everyday Roman soldier. They probably more spoke Greek.
Yeah. So what we can just take from this short discussion is that most definitely Jesus lived in a multilingual society.
Yes.
And being the genius that he was, it's very clear that he would have been proficient in all 4 languages at the very least.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of scholarship is supporting that. I'm not fully up with that, but you should look into Sevenster, Sevenster. Look up that guy and look up the scholarship that's discussing that, because I think more scholars are trying to argue for more Greek speaking among the early Christians, among the early Jews of Palestine.
Thanks, Justin.
Great stuff. Any other questions? Was there any more, Jonathan?
Everything I didn't cut off.
Oops, sorry. We don't have any hands raised currently.
Well, it's a great time.
Excellent stuff.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm coming to South Africa.
Yes, I'm going to hold you to that.
Let's start talking about that. I really want to do that.
Garrett says, one more question, Justin. How much do you think it's going to rain today? It doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon.
That's not fair to people outside of Dallas.
Maybe we should have a Christology symposium in all 3 major universities, and maybe at Potch, Joburg, and Pretoria at Rao, and get quite a few guys coming over. That might be very interesting.
That'd be awesome.
What do you say, Jonathan? You up for it?
Indeed.
Love that.
Yeah, for sure.
Be great.
Yeah. Yeah, Justin, you and I should go over to South Africa sometime.
Yeah. When I plan to go, you come at the same time. That'd be so fun.
Yep.
I gotta go. Well, I gotta find a way to get to North Africa though, because I gotta go to my dead theologian, but lives, Augustine.
Oh yes.
I gotta go see him. Go see where he was.
I don't want to disappoint you, but he's dead for quite a few years now.
Oh, he isn't still living? I thought he was one of those that Jesus said he can remain alive until he comes back.
Well, actually, you know, Justin, that the Doctrines and Covenants, section 7 of the Mormon Scriptures tells us that John the Apostle gets to remain alive, and so I sometimes wonder if still living on the island of Patmos somewhere, and he's not yet got the memo that the Roman Empire is no longer in existence. We need to get him that memo.
That's great. One of the really bad vampire movies, I think it was Dracula 2000. It came out in 2000, and it was one of the worst movies ever. But the best part of it was the premise was that the vampire Dracula, I don't know if it's Dracula or a vampire, but basically he was Judas, and Jesus said he must roam the earth cursed until he comes back. So they switched it from John to Judas, and Judas became a vampire. That was brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible movie, but I love that idea.
Yeah, you get crazy stories like that in some of the apocryphal gospels.
Yeah, I'm sure they found that somewhere, maybe. Okay. We're done. We had. I think we peaked at about 27 people, or 28 people.
31.
Sorry, Ralph?
31.
31. Okay. We're down to 18 now.
Yeah.
The FBI has submitted a question. How is it the Father can't be seen according to some Christians, but yet the Son can be seen? How is that possible if both the Father and Son share the same glory? Slightly off topic, but do you have any comments on that, Justin?
Yeah, I would just say that, the whole point in the New Testament over and over again about no one has seen the Father at any time, but we have seen the Son, and things like where the Son says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Speaking of Irenaeus, I like the way that Irenaeus says it. He says, the Son is the visible of the Father, and the Father is the invisible of the Son. And so the whole idea is that God is spirit. And so God, who I define as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are all invisible in the sense that they're spirit. But Jesus is God, the Son, in the flesh, and that's why we see him. So it's just a matter of the incarnation is the distinction here.
I love the way that Clement of Rome puts it in his epistle to the church in Corinth, where he says that through Christ we look up to the highest heaven and see as in a glass the peerless perfection of the face of God. Through Christ the eyes of our hearts are opened and are dim, and clouded understanding unfolds like a flower to the light. For through Christ the Lord permits us to taste the wisdom of eternity.
It's good. I like how when people put it, the Nicene Creed says Jesus is God from God, light from light, true God from true God. But it's important to remember that God the Father is God from no one. God the Father is not God from God. God the Father is just God. And that's the distinction that's important to think about.
Amen. Okay, well, it doesn't look like anyone's racing to the microphone to ask any further questions, so perhaps we could call it a night there.
It's a great time, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Thanks for doing this great ministry. This is awesome.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us. It's much appreciated. It's much valued.
Great to finally meet you, Rudolph.
Nice to meet you, Justin. We hope to have you on again.
Jake,
let's keep talking about going there. Let's keep talking about that trip.
Jay Curry is asking who's on next week. Next week we have Dr. Günther Betschley coming on to talk to us about paleontology and Neo-Darwinian evolution. Dr. Günther Betschley is a German paleontologist who is an intelligent design proponent and a skeptic of Neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. So that will be a fascinating webinar as well.
Will be.
All right. Well, good night, Justin. Thanks again for coming on, and hopefully we can have you again sometime.
Yeah, love to. Thanks for having me. God bless all you guys.
Thank you,
Justin.
Thanks for everyone who participated.